May 1940, spring should have brought life to Europe, but instead it delivered thunder. Across the plains of northern France, a storm of steel and fire broke loose as Germany unleashed a new kind of warfare, blitzkrieg, the lightning war. It was swift, brutal, and merciless. For months, the Allies had waited behind the Maginot Line, convinced that the lessons of the First World War would hold true, that wars were won by endurance, by fortifications, by the patient weight of defense. But Adolf Hitler had learned something different. War, he believed, was about momentum. About shock. About never giving your enemy the time to breathe. And on May 10, 1940, the German army proved him right. The German offensive struck like a sudden avalanche. While Allied forces braced for attack through Belgium, expecting a repeat of 1914, Hitler's generals unleashed their armored divisions through the dense Ardennes forest, a region the Allies had considered impassable. It was a masterstroke of deception. Tanks that were never supposed to cross those winding forest roads poured through the trees, supported by Stuka dive bombers screaming overhead. Within days, the impossible became reality. Panzer divisions broke through the French lines near Sedan, splitting the Allied front in two. To the north, the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and the best of the French army were racing east to meet what they thought was the main German attack. By the time they realized the trap, the jaws were already closing behind them. The Netherlands fell first. The German blitzkrieg struck with mechanical precision. Paratroopers descended on bridges and airfields before Dutch defenses could even mobilize. Rotterdam, a city filled with civilians, was bombed into submission. On May 15, the Netherlands surrendered. In Belgium, the story was no different. Despite the courage of the Belgian army, the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, and the German armor sliced through the countryside. The French and British rushed in to help, but every mile gained brought them deeper into the trap. The Allies still believed in the old rhythm of war, that battles were fought over weeks or months. But blitzkrieg was a storm measured in hours. German tanks didn't stop, they surged. Columns of armor bypassed strong points, leaving pockets of resistance to be dealt with later by infantry. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to smoke before sunset. By May 20th, the German spearhead reached the English Channel near Abbeville, cutting off nearly 500,000 Allied troops from the rest of France. What had begun as a campaign of defense was now a desperate struggle for survival. The BEF, alongside French and Belgian divisions, found themselves trapped in a tightening pocket along the coast. To their south, German tanks blocked every road. To their north, the sea, cold, vast, and unforgiving. Soldiers spoke of it as if waking from a dream. Only days earlier, they had marched into Belgium under cheering crowds, confident in victory. Now, they dug trenches in foreign sand, surrounded by smoke and ruin. The Luftwaffe's bombers prowled overhead, targeting convoys, bridges, and fleeing civilians. The roads were clogged with refugees, mothers pushing carts, children clutching their pets, priests carrying crosses, all moving west toward a horizon that no longer promised safety. In Paris, chaos reigned. The French government was paralyzed by disbelief. Communications broke down, orders contradicted each other, and morale evaporated. Reports of German advances were dismissed as exaggeration until it was too late. Field commanders, overwhelmed by speed and confusion, struggled to regroup. The traditional lines of defense were meaningless in this new kind of war. Where the French army moved by map and telegraph, the Germans moved by radio and instinct. Winston Churchill, newly appointed as Britain's Prime Minister, crossed the Channel to meet with his French counterparts. What he found was despair, generals admitting defeat before the battle was even over. The line could not hold. The government was already considering surrender. Churchill returned to London grim-faced, knowing that if France fell, Britain would stand alone. By the end of May, the Allied armies were cornered around the coastal city of Dunkirk. The German advance had been so swift that entire divisions had no time to withdraw. Tanks rolled through abandoned French villages, past columns of prisoners and the ruins of Allied supply lines. The retreat was chaotic, men marching day and night without food, columns of vehicles abandoned when they ran out of fuel. Along the beaches, soldiers gathered by the tens of thousands, staring out across the channel toward home. They waited for orders that would never come. They waited for ships that didn't exist. They waited, as the shadow of annihilation grew closer. The scale of the defeat became undeniable. The once proud armies of France and Britain, forces that had seemed invincible only months earlier, were now trapped like animals. The dream of holding back the German war machine had collapsed into smoke and silence. And yet, in this darkest moment, something unexpected began to stir. In the midst of chaos, a plan was forming, a desperate, impossible idea whispered through the ranks and across command tables in Dover. If the army could not be saved by victory, perhaps it could be saved by escape. The French countryside burned behind them. The Channel winds howled ahead. Between them stood the city of Dunkirk, the last gateway home. The thunder of retreat rolled through northern France. The British Expeditionary Force, BF, once 400,000 strong, was now a fragmented, exhausted mass of men moving ever closer to the sea. Town after town had fallen. Bridges lay in ruins. Convoys of trucks and artillery jammed the narrow French roads as the reality set in. There would be no counterattack, no grand stand. By late May 1940, Dunkirk, a small port city on the Channel coast, had become their last refuge. But it was not a sanctuary. It was a trap. From the air, Dunkirk must have looked like the end of the world. Smoke from burning fuel depots mixed with the gray sea mist, spreading across the beaches in a heavy, choking fog. Endless lines of soldiers stretched from the dunes to the harbor, their rifles slung, their faces streaked with fatigue and disbelief. These were not defeated men, not yet. They were waiting for orders, waiting for hope, waiting for ships that had not yet come. The sea was their last frontier. Behind them, the German panzer divisions had closed the circle. The retreat had been brutal. German armored columns under General Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel swept in from the south and east, cutting off every road to safety. Villages that had stood for centuries were flattened by tank shells and Stuka bombers. Fields that had once fed northern France were now graveyards of steel and men. The roads to Dunkirk were choked with chaos, thousands of refugees fleeing alongside retreating soldiers. Horse carts mingled with army lorries, families carried what little they could salvage. Along the ditches lay the wreckage of trucks burned by their own crews, so they wouldn't fall into German hands. At every bend, the sky was alive with the scream of Luftwaffe engines. Bombs fell in patterns, tearing apart columns of men. Survivors scattered into the fields, hiding in the grass, clutching their helmets, praying the next explosion wouldn't be theirs. When the BF finally reached Dunkirk, they found a city already half destroyed. German bombers had reduced the harbor to a smoking ruin. Warehouses burned along the waterfront, sending columns of black smoke curling into the sky. The streets were filled with wounded men and civilians who had refused to flee. Yet amid the destruction, soldiers began to organize. Officers marked out defensive positions around the perimeter. The plan, if it could be called one, was to hold the line long enough for an evacuation to begin. But every day, the German grip tightened. The panzers advanced from the west and south, pushing the Allied perimeter into a shrinking pocket. By May 27, Dunkirk was completely surrounded on land. Only the sea remained open. It was here, at the edge of France, that the fate of the British Army, and perhaps Britain itself, would be decided. There was no silence at Dunkirk. From dawn until dusk, the city and its beaches were bombed without mercy. The Luftwaffe's Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers became a constant terror. Their sirens, designed to scream as they plunged toward their targets, echoed across the beaches like the cries of a banshee. Each descent meant death, fuel tanks exploded, ships burned, men dove for cover in the sand. The harbor, once a lifeline, was turned into a graveyard of ships. Destroyers and transports were struck in the water and sank within minutes. Oil slicks spread across the surface, igniting in great orange waves. Soldiers already knee-deep in the surf found themselves swimming through fire. And yet, through all of it, the men endured. They dug trenches in the dunes, filled sandbags, and tried to maintain discipline even as their world burned. Some played cards, others prayed, and many simply stared out toward the gray horizon, toward England, only 30 miles away, invisible beyond the smoke. It wasn't only soldiers trapped at Dunkirk. Tens of thousands of civilians, French villagers, Belgian families, old men, women with children, had fled ahead of the German advance. They crowded the same roads, the same fields, the same beaches. Many hoped that British ships would take them too, though few ever did. The human tide was overwhelming. The wounded lay in makeshift hospitals and churches and schools. Food ran out. Water became scarce. Rumors spread faster than orders, that the Germans were executing prisoners, that rescue ships had been sunk, that the end would come by morning. At night, the fires of Dunkirk lit the sky for miles. The beaches glowed orange under the bombardment. For many, it felt as if the very sea was closing in on them. By May 28, the news was almost complete. The German 18th Army pressed in from the west, while the 7th Panzer Division, led by Rommel, attacked from the south. Only the northern corridor, guarded by a mix of British and French units, remained open, a fragile artery through which men and vehicles streamed toward Dunkirk. But then, inexplicably, the advance halted. German armored units, poised to strike the beaches, were ordered to stop. It was Hitler's halt order, one of the most debated decisions of the war. For 3 days, the tanks waited while the Luftwaffe continued the attack. Those days would become the difference between annihilation and escape. Inside the shrinking pocket, the BEF used the precious time to dig in. Engineers repaired roads, organized supply dumps, and prepared for a defense that could last days, perhaps hours. The Royal Navy began assessing how many ships could reach the beaches. Few believed escape was possible. Fewer still believed survival was deserved. By the end of May, Dunkirk's beaches stretched for miles, covered with soldiers waiting to be rescued. They stood in endless queues in the surf, rifles slung, packs on their backs, silent except for the crash of the tide. There were no piers long enough for ships to dock, so the men waded out into the water, clinging to ropes or makeshift gangways as small boats ferried them to larger vessels offshore. Each trip was a gamble. Bombers attacked without warning, sinking ships already overloaded with men. Sometimes, survivors of one sinking were rescued, only for their next ship to be bombed as well. The air was filled with screams, orders, and the roar of engines. Still, the lines on the beach never broke. Discipline held. The soldiers waited their turn, knowing that each minute they stood there, the enemy crept closer. For many, Dunkirk had ceased to be a battlefield, it was a waiting room for fate. From the cliffs of Dover, British observers could see the smoke rising across the channel. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, watching reports come in by the hour, called it the greatest military disaster in our history. Yet even as defeat loomed, an idea was forming, desperate, improvised, but possible, an evacuation by sea. If the army could not win, it could still be saved. And so, as the trapped soldiers of Dunkirk prepared to make their last stand, the Royal Navy began assembling every ship, boat, and vessel that could float, from destroyers to fishing trawlers. The beaches that had become a prison would soon become a gateway to deliverance. The miracle was yet to come. The The smoke of Dunkirk could be seen from across the channel. In the quiet coastal town of Dover, black columns rose above the sea like funeral banners. Each one told the same story: ships burning, soldiers stranded, an army on the edge of destruction. It was the evening of May 26, 1940, when the order came. Deep within the stone tunnels of Dover Castle, a hidden command center hummed to life. Maps were unrolled, telephones crackled, and the air filled with the tense energy of desperation. The plan that would save an army and perhaps a nation had just been given a name. Operation Dynamo had begun. The operations nerve center was buried beneath the medieval fortress that had once watched over the channel since the days of knights and kings. Now it was the command post of Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, a quiet, methodical officer whose calm under pressure had earned him Churchill's trust. Ramsay's office was carved into the chalk cliffs, a maze of narrow corridors lit by buzzing lamps. Here, his small team of naval officers, engineers, and telegraph operators worked around the clock. The name Dynamo came from the dynamo room in the tunnels, a nod to the generator that powered their communications, and a metaphor for the energy they would need to pull off the impossible. Their mission was clear but nearly hopeless: evacuate the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk, 300,000 men trapped between the German army and the sea. No one in the room pretended it would succeed. The Royal Navy's ships were too few, the Luftwaffe too strong, the tides too unpredictable. Ramsay himself estimated that perhaps 45,000 men might be saved before the Germans closed in completely. But Churchill's words were unambiguous: we must bring as many home as we can. At all costs. When Ramsay first presented the plan to his superiors, he did so with characteristic understatement. Gentlemen, it is a hazardous operation. But it is the only one available. The logic was brutal but sound. Without the army, Britain was finished. Without the BEF, there would be no line of defense against invasion. These men were not just soldiers, they were the very heart of Britain's future resistance. The Royal Navy began assembling every vessel that could make the crossing: destroyers, minesweepers, passenger ferries, tugboats, even fishing trawlers. Orders were sent across southern England to requisition any seaworthy boat, regardless of size or age. While Ramsay's staff worked in the tunnels, British harbors buzzed with activity. Crews loaded supplies, mapped minefields, and studied the treacherous sandbanks and tides around Dunkirk. Sailors painted over ship names, camouflaged decks, and filled lifeboats with rope, bread, and morphine. They had no illusions. Most of these vessels would not return. On the night of May 26, the first ships set out from Dover. The sea was calm, the wind sharp and cold. The destroyer HMS Wakeful led the way, cutting through the darkness toward the burning coast. Behind her came smaller vessels, their lights doused, their crews scanning the horizon for the glow of fire that marked Dunkirk. As they neared the French shore, the extent of the devastation became clear. The beaches were covered in soldiers, lines stretching for miles, men waiting silently under the dim moonlight. Occasionally, flares from German artillery illuminated the scene, waves crashing over wrecked boats, bodies floating in the surf, aircraft diving low to strafe the sands. Each destroyer that reached the shore filled its decks with soldiers until there was no room left to stand. Then it turned back for England, where more ships waited to take its place. It was the start of a rhythm that would last 9 relentless days and nights, the heartbeat of Operation Dynamo. At dawn, the Luftwaffe arrived. Bombers swept down in formation, dropping their payloads on the harbor and beaches. The sound was apocalyptic: the shriek of Stukas, the thunder of explosions, the hiss of burning fuel. The Royal Navy's destroyers became prime targets. Ships that had survived the night now burned in shallow waters. The HMS Grenade was struck at Dunkirk's mole, the long concrete pier extending into the sea, and exploded in flames. HMS Wakeful, returning for another load, was hit by torpedoes, killing nearly 700 soldiers aboard. But even as the bombs fell, the evacuation continued. British and French troops waded into the surf, clinging to ropes or makeshift bridges. Officers shouted for order while shells burst around them. For every ship that sank, 2 more arrived. The Royal Air Force, fighting high above, did what it could. Many soldiers on the beaches cursed the RAF for their apparent absence, unaware that British pilots were battling the Luftwaffe miles inland, losing men to keep the skies just clear enough for the ships below. Fate itself seemed to intervene. Over the following days, weather conditions shifted in Britain's favor. The Channel, often tempestuous in spring, remained eerily calm. Low cloud cover limited the Luftwaffe's ability to strike. Even the tides seemed to move in rhythm with Ramsay's needs, allowing smaller boats to reach closer to shore than anyone had expected. It was as if the elements themselves had chosen sides. Ramsay's reports came in hourly. 3,500 men evacuated. 9,000 men. 18,000, each figure felt miraculous, but the danger was far from over. On the beaches, morale wavered between hope and despair. Men slept in shallow pits dug into the sand, waking only to the sound of bombers. Many had not eaten in days. Still, the lines held, disciplined, stoic, endless. Each dawn brought more ships. Each night, more explosions. In London, Churchill watched the numbers grow, his face unreadable. He knew the evacuation's success would decide Britain's future. If the army was lost, an invasion of England would follow within weeks. If it was saved, Britain could fight on. Every night, he returned to the War Cabinet with the same question: how many today? Every morning, Ramsay's messages came in by telegram, each one more astonishing than the last. What had begun as an act of desperation was becoming a story of survival beyond logic. But Churchill refused to celebrate, not yet. He knew the German army still pressed in from all sides. The Luftwaffe still owned the skies. And across the Channel, hundreds of thousands of men were still stranded. Wars, he reminded his staff grimly, are not won by evacuations. And yet, for this war, for this moment, survival itself was victory. By the third day, word of the evacuation had spread across England. Fishermen, ferry captains, yacht owners, all began offering their boats to the Royal Navy. Hundreds of small craft would soon join the rescue effort, filling the Channel with the most unlikely armada in history. But that would come later. For now, in the tunnels beneath Dover Castle, Ramsay's team worked in silence, their pencils scratching across maps, their clocks ticking in rhythm with the tide. They were orchestrating a miracle, not of technology, but of endurance, courage, and sheer will. The evacuation of Dunkirk had begun. The outcome was still uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, the British Army was moving, not backward, but home. For 10 relentless days, the German war machine had moved like lightning across France, unstoppable, precise, and merciless. From the Ardennes to the Channel coast, towns had fallen like dominoes beneath the weight of the blitzkrieg. The British Expeditionary Force, trapped along the beaches of Dunkirk, seemed doomed to annihilation. And then, suddenly, the storm stopped. Engines fell silent. Tank columns halted. The dust settled across the French countryside. At the very moment of certain victory, Adolf Hitler ordered his armored divisions to stand down. It was a command that stunned even his own generals. A command that would become one of the most puzzling and consequential decisions in military history. By late May 1940, the German advance had achieved what no strategist had imagined possible. In just 2 weeks, the panzer divisions under Generals Heinz Guderian, Erwin Rommel, and Ewald von Kleist had cut through France's defenses like a knife through silk. They had bypassed the Maginot Line, trapped the British and French forces in northern France, and reached the Channel coast near Abbeville on May 20th. The Allied armies were split, their lines shattered. From the German command perspective, total victory was only days away. The BEF was pinned against the sea, with nowhere left to retreat. One more coordinated strike would finish the job. Guderian's panzers were ready. They had outrun supply lines, fought for days without rest, but morale was high. They could see the smoke of Dunkirk rising on the horizon. To the German tank commanders, The order was simple: one more push, and the war in the West would be over. Then the radio crackled with new orders from High Command. All armored units are to halt their advance. No further movement until authorized. The message spread confusion through the ranks. Officers looked at one another, certain it was a mistake. The most powerful army in the world had just been told to stop. The halt order came from the very top, from Adolf Hitler himself. But even within his own headquarters, few agreed with it. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of the Blitzkrieg, was furious. He had spent weeks pushing his tanks through impossible terrain to encircle the Allies, and now, just as the final blow was within reach, he was told to wait. Guderian argued that a pause would allow the British to regroup, to build defenses, to escape. Every hour lost, he warned, gives the enemy life. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A, was more cautious. His tanks had outrun their infantry, their flanks were exposed, and supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Rundstedt feared a counterattack or ambush, especially in the marshy terrain near Dunkirk, which was unsuitable for heavy armor. Hitler, always distrustful of his generals, sided with Rundstedt. He believed that the Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring, could finish the job from the air. Göring had personally assured him that his bombers could destroy the trapped army on the beaches. "Leave it to my Luftwaffe," Göring promised. "Not a single Englishman will escape." And so, against the advice of his most brilliant field commanders, Hitler chose to pause the advance. For 48 hours, the panzers idled while the Luftwaffe prepared its assault. Historians have argued for decades about Hitler's reasons. Some say it was arrogance, his belief that the British were already beaten. Others claim it was psychological. Hitler still admired Britain, imagining a peace deal that would leave the British Empire intact. But another explanation was fear. During the First World War, Hitler had served as a soldier and witnessed firsthand what happened when an army advanced too far, too fast. He remembered the mud, the attrition, and the disastrous counterattacks that had cost Germany victory in 1918. Now, as his generals urged him to push forward, the ghost of that past war haunted his decisions. He feared losing control. To him, the halt order was caution, a calculated pause before the kill. To history, it became the moment the kill was lost. As the tanks sat idle, the Luftwaffe moved in. For 3 days, Göring's bombers pounded Dunkirk. Waves of Stukas screamed down over the beaches, turning ships into twisted wrecks and men into shadows in the sand. Thousands died, but thousands more endured. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, rose to challenge them. British and Polish pilots fought desperate battles high above the Channel, buying precious time for the evacuation that had just begun. Every hour that passed, every minute the German tanks waited, more Allied soldiers made it to the beaches, to the ships, to the sea. On May 28, after 3 crucial days, Hitler lifted the halt order. The tanks surged forward again, engines roaring. But by then, it was too late. In those brief, suspended hours, the Allies had built defensive positions around Dunkirk. French and British rearguard units held the perimeter with fanatical courage, sacrificing themselves to delay the German advance. And across the Channel, the Royal Navy's Operation Dynamo had begun in earnest. Ships, trawlers, and fishing boats were streaming toward Dunkirk. The miracle was underway. When the German panzers finally reached the outskirts of the city, they found resistance where there should have been none. The beaches were no longer a killing ground, they were an escape route. In the grand scope of World War II, few decisions had such profound consequences as the halt order. Had Hitler pressed the attack, the British Expeditionary Force would almost certainly have been destroyed. Britain, stripped of its army, might have been forced to surrender within weeks. The entire course of the war, from the Battle of Britain to D-Day, might never have happened. Instead, a single pause, a hesitation born of overconfidence and doubt, gave the Allies the narrowest of lifelines. Even as German officers seethed in frustration, one British observer later wrote, "It was as if Providence had intervened, as if the enemy had suddenly gone blind." The halt order became Hitler's fatal mistake, a moment when history itself seemed to pivot on the edge of chance. On the beaches of Dunkirk, no one knew why the attacks had stopped, only that they had. In those brief days of quiet between bombardments, British engineers fortified the evacuation routes. Communication lines were re-established, wounded soldiers were gathered, and defenses around the perimeter were strengthened. The men, still trapped, felt hope return. Officers shouted orders, boats were sighted on the horizon, and rumors spread that the Royal Navy was coming for them. By the time the Germans advanced again, the miracle had already begun to take shape. The halt order had given Britain what it needed most, time. The morning of May 29, 1940, began with the sound of waves and ended with the roar of fire. At dawn, the sea outside Dunkirk lay still, gray and glassy beneath a thin shroud of mist. Soldiers on the beaches stared out toward the horizon, searching for ships. Behind them, the town smoldered in ruins. Smoke drifted from the docks where oil depots burned, filling the air with the sickly scent of fuel and death. They had survived the night. But in the distance, faintly at first, came a low, throbbing hum. Engines. The sound grew, echoing across the channel and over the dunes. Men looked up. The horizon darkened. The Luftwaffe was coming. By the end of May, the German High Command had made Dunkirk their primary target. Hitler's tanks might have paused, but Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe had not. Determined to prove that air power alone could crush the enemy, Göring unleashed a relentless assault on the beaches, the harbor, and every ship that dared to approach. Wave after wave of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, their sirens wailing, mechanical shrieks designed to terrify those below. Soldiers dropped flat into the sand, pressing their faces against the ground as explosions ripped across the shore. Each Stuka carried a single 500-kilogram bomb, and each bomb that hit found a cluster of men, a truck, or a waiting boat. The sea erupted into fountains of spray and steel. One British corporal later wrote in his diary, "The noise was like the end of the world. You could feel the air being torn apart." The beaches of Dunkirk, already crowded with soldiers, now became killing grounds. At the harbor, the destruction was even worse. Ships lined up to load troops at the eastern mole, the narrow pier jutting into the channel. It was their only lifeline, the only place deep enough for large vessels to dock. When the bombers came, the harbor turned into chaos. A formation of Heinkel 111s swept in low, dropping their bombs in perfect lines. The HMS Grenade, a Royal Navy destroyer, took a direct hit while moored at the mole. The blast ripped through her hull and ignited her ammunition stores. She burned for hours before finally exploding, scattering wreckage and men into the sea. Nearby, another ship, HMS Wakeful, already filled with hundreds of rescued soldiers, was struck by torpedoes from German aircraft. She sank in minutes. Of the 700 men aboard, fewer than 30 survived. The harbor was now a floating graveyard. Oil from ruptured tankers spread across the water, catching fire as bombs fell. Flames crawled across the surface, turning the sea itself into a burning mirror. Men who jumped overboard to escape found themselves swimming through fire. Above the inferno, the Royal Air Force fought to protect them. Squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes engaged the Luftwaffe in brutal dogfights high above the channel. They flew in small formations, outnumbered but determined to defend the helpless soldiers below. Pilots from Britain, Poland, and Czechoslovakia fought side by side, chasing enemy bombers through trails of smoke. Every Stuka shot down meant a ship saved, a line of soldiers spared. But it was a battle few on the ground ever saw. From the beaches, soldiers looked up and saw only black dots crossing the sky, and more bombs falling. Many cursed the RAF for their absence, not realizing that dozens of British pilots were dying unseen, high above the clouds. One RAF pilot, squadron leader Alan Deere, later recalled, "It was chaos above and chaos below. You didn't think about glory. You just tried to keep them away from the beaches for one more minute." For every bomber destroyed, another seemed to appear. As the day wore on, the attacks intensified. Every hour brought new bomb runs, new casualties. Soldiers dug into the sand like burrowing animals, their helmets half buried as explosions thundered around them. The tide brought in the dead, bodies rolling gently in the surf, their uniforms dark with oil. The living stood among them, silent, waiting for their turn to board a ship. Each rescue attempt was an act of madness. Boats packed with soldiers capsized in the waves. Ships overloaded with men were torn apart by bombs before they could reach open water. Yet more soldiers waited out to replace them, forming endless human chains stretching into the sea. A British sergeant remembered. "We stood shoulder to shoulder in the water, waist deep, waiting our turn. We could see the ships burning, hear the bombs, feel the heat of the fires, and still we waited." The discipline of the trapped army was astonishing. In the midst of chaos, the lines never dissolved. There was no riot, no rush to escape, only order, patience, and grim acceptance. The city of Dunkirk itself was dying. What had once been a quiet French port was now a shattered carcass of stone and flame. Civilians who had refused to flee huddled in cellars as their homes collapsed above them. Firefighters, priests, and volunteers pulled the wounded from burning buildings as German aircraft strafed the streets. By night, the horizon glowed orange, the fires of Dunkirk visible from England's southern coast. Observers on the white cliffs of Dover watched in silence as the city burned. One British officer later wrote, "It looked as if the whole of France was on fire." By the end of May 29th, Dunkirk had become a vision of hell. The Luftwaffe had destroyed much of the harbor, sunk dozens of ships, and killed thousands of men. The British command feared that Operation Dynamo might collapse under the weight of air attacks. Yet, even in the midst of carnage, the evacuation continued. Ramsey's reports from Dover read like dispatches from another world. 17,000 evacuated. 28,000. 40,000. Every ship that reached England brought back men who could barely speak, their faces blackened with soot and salt. Some wept openly upon seeing the cliffs of Dover, unable to believe they were alive. Others simply stared, hollow, silent, empty. Churchill received each update with a grim sense of awe. The operation was succeeding, but at a cost almost too heavy to bear. When the sun set over Dunkirk, the fires still burned. The air reeked of smoke, oil, and cordite. The beaches were littered with twisted metal, torn uniforms, and the remnants of destroyed boats. Yet beneath the chaos, something extraordinary was happening. Each night, more ships returned across the channel. Each day, more men reached the beaches and joined the lines. The Luftwaffe could destroy ships, but it could not destroy determination. The men on the sand had seen death, but they refused to surrender. Somewhere out there, across the smoke, beyond the flames, was England. And as long as the horizon held, hope still lived. The order went out quietly at first, carried by phone calls, naval dispatches, and word of mouth through coastal towns along England's southern shore. Every vessel that could float was to prepare for sea, fishing trawlers, lifeboats, tugboats, sailing yachts, pleasure craft, barges, ferries. No one quite understood what they were being asked to do. Only that the army was trapped, and the navy needed help. In ports like Ramsgate, Margate, and Dover, men who had spent their lives fishing or ferrying tourists now stood side by side with naval officers, staring at charts of the English Channel covered in red pins. They were told of the bombardments, the minefields, the German planes hunting everything that moved. And then someone would quietly ask, "Can your boat make it?" There was no ceremony, no hesitation. Engines coughed to life, sails were raised, and one by one, the little ships of England set out into the grey water. Some had never crossed the channel before. Many didn't even have radios. But still they went, a ragtag armada of fishermen, dockworkers, and volunteers, heading into a war zone. The first miles were deceptively calm. The sea lay flat under a haze of smoke drifting from France, the horizon glowing faintly orange. The men aboard could see flashes of light far off where Dunkirk burned. They pressed on, navigating by compass and instinct, steering through wreckage and oil slicks, through the remains of ships that hadn't made it back. When the coast finally came into view, the air changed. The sound of engines was replaced by the scream of Stuka dive bombers. Shells fell into the water, sending up fountains that rocked the small craft like toys. One fishing boat took a near hit that splintered its mast, another caught fire and drifted, its crew jumping into the oily surf. Yet more came, weaving through the explosions, determined to reach the beaches. On shore, the soldiers saw them appear through the smoke, a line of small silhouettes rising and falling with the waves. At first, many thought they were hallucinations. Then came the shouts, "Boats! Boats are coming!" Men who had been silent for days began to cheer, waving helmets and rifles. The sight of those tiny craft against the inferno seemed impossible, and yet it was real. The first rescues were chaos. The larger ships couldn't get close, so the small boats came right up to the sand. Soldiers waded out to meet them, waist deep in water, helping one another aboard. The boats rocked under the weight, overloaded with men in soaked uniforms. Some tried to hand up rifles and helmets, most carried nothing but exhaustion. They sat wherever there was space, on decks, gunwales, even on each other's laps, silent except for the distant sound of bombs. Every trip across the channel was a nightmare. The Luftwaffe hunted them constantly, strafing the convoys with machine gun fire. Pilots in small craft could see the silver flashes of bullets hitting the water around them. Some tried to shield the men with their own bodies, others simply prayed and kept going. The sea was full of wreckage, life jackets, helmets, planks of burning wood. Many crews picked up survivors from the waves, pulling men aboard who could barely speak, their eyes glazed from shock. One of the smallest boats, the Tamzine, was barely 30 feet long and powered by a single engine that sounded like a sewing machine. Its owner, a fisherman from Kent, made 5 crossings in 3 days, rescuing hundreds of soldiers. Another, a Thames pleasure cruiser called Sundowner, was captained by a retired naval officer and his wife. They managed to cram 97 men aboard a vessel built for 20. There were hundreds of such stories. The crew of a paddle steamer pulled drowning men from the surf until their decks were slick with oil. A group of lifeboat volunteers rescued entire units trapped on sandbars when the tide fell. Even as bombs fell and ships burned around them, the little ships kept coming, threading through smoke and fire, carrying men from death to life. When they returned to England, the docks were lined with people waiting to help. Nurses and volunteers handed out tea and blankets. The rescued soldiers, many still trembling, stumbled ashore to applause and silence in equal measure. Some kissed the ground, others simply stared across the water, whispering the same words again and again, "They came for us." Over the next few days, the little ships became the heart of the operation. The Royal Navy organized them into convoys, using the small craft to ferry men from the shallows to the destroyers waiting offshore. The rhythm of rescue never stopped, day and night, through smoke and shellfire, through exhaustion and grief. Back in Dover's tunnels, Admiral Ramsay received hourly updates. Each report defied belief: 10,000 more rescued, then 20, then 30. The numbers climbed beyond anything expected. It was as if a miracle had taken form in wood and steel, powered not by orders, but by courage. By the end of the evacuation, nearly 900 civilian vessels had crossed the channel. Many never returned. But those that did carried the spirit of a nation, the proof that even in retreat, bravery could be found in the humblest of hands. When Churchill later called it a miracle of deliverance, he wasn't speaking of generals or armies. He was speaking of them, the ordinary men who looked across the sea, saw a nightmare unfolding, and decided to go anyway. The little ships of Dunkirk had turned a defeat into defiance. And in doing so, they gave Britain back its hope. They knew they would not be coming home. From the moment the order was given, every man who remained behind understood that his task was not to survive, but to buy time. The evacuation at Dunkirk depended on it. The ships could not load men from the beaches if the Germans broke through. Someone had to hold the perimeter, and that meant fighting until there was nothing left to fight with. British and French soldiers, remnants of shattered divisions, dug in around the shrinking pocket that surrounded Dunkirk. The line stretched through towns whose names would soon be burned into memory: Calais, Bergues, Newport, and La Panne. Behind them, the beaches were filled with men waiting for rescue. Ahead of them, the dust clouds of German armor rose on the horizon. At Calais, the 30th Brigade and elements of the Queen's Royal Regiment made their stand. The ancient port city had become a fortress overnight. Sandbags and overturned trucks blocked the streets, rifles pointed from windows shattered by shellfire. When the first German tanks appeared on the outskirts, they were met with a hail of machine gun fire and mortars. It was a hopeless defense, but it slowed the advance for precious hours. The men at Calais received a message from High Command: every hour you hold out will help save the BEF. They understood what that meant. There would be no rescue for them. While others were being lifted from the beaches, they were to stand and die where they were. The fighting was savage. Stukas screamed overhead, reducing whole blocks to rubble. The defenders fell back street by street, turning each building into a strong point. When their ammunition ran out, they fought with bayonets, then with fists. On the evening of May 26, flames engulfed the harbor. The last radio message from Calais crackled through static: "We are still holding. God save the King." To the east, near Bergues and Newport, the French 68th Division fought shoulder to shoulder with British units to keep the German infantry at bay. The air was filled with the smell of cordite and burning oil. Entire regiments were reduced to handfuls of men, but they did not retreat. Every delay, every counterattack, meant another ship could reach the beaches, another 1,000 men could live. The soldiers called it La Ligne du Sacrifice, the line of sacrifice. They fought in waterlogged trenches filled with smoke, surrounded by the bodies of friends, their faces blackened with soot and sweat. They had no illusions about the outcome. Yet when couriers came asking for volunteers to cover the next withdrawal, men stepped forward without hesitation. One French sergeant, bleeding from a shrapnel wound, told a British officer, "Tell your men to go. France is finished, but England must live." He turned back toward the gunfire, his figure swallowed by the smoke. By the last days of May, the perimeter around Dunkirk had shrunk to a thin crescent along the coast. Thousands of Allied troops were already crossing the channel, but tens of thousands remained trapped behind the line, holding back the German tide with dwindling ammunition and raw determination. the defenders could hear the roar of engines and see the flashes of artillery through the night. The ground shook as panzers pushed closer. When the Germans finally broke through at Bergs, hand-to-hand fighting erupted among the ruins. French and British soldiers fought side by side, firing from cellars and rooftops, throwing grenades into advancing tanks. The air was thick with smoke and screams. Those who could no longer fight destroyed their weapons, refusing to surrender until the last possible moment. In the chaos, messages reached the beaches: "The line is holding. Keep loading the ships." For those waiting to board, those words meant everything. The men on the beaches knew someone was out there dying for them, buying them another hour, another night, another chance to live. When the line finally collapsed, it did so not in panic, but in silence. Survivors from the rearguard were taken prisoner, many wounded, all exhausted. They had fought until there was nothing left to fight with. Dunkirk was saved because they had refused to abandon their posts. Later, Churchill would call their stand the highest example of discipline and sacrifice. But the men who held the line asked for no glory. They had measured their lives not in victories, but in minutes. Each one wrestled from the jaws of defeat. While others sailed home to England, the rearguard remained in France, surrounded by the enemy and by fire. They were the forgotten ones, left in the ashes of a dying world. Yet without them, there would have been no miracle. The beaches were a living tide of men. From the dunes of La Panne to the harbor of Dunkirk, soldiers stood in endless lines stretching to the sea, helmets glinting beneath the smoke, rifles slung, faces blank from exhaustion. The sound of the surf was broken only by the distant thunder of guns and the occasional cry of "boat coming in." For a week they had waited under bombardment, digging shallow pits in the sand for shelter, watching comrades die beside them. Now, at last, the rescue was in full swing. Operation Dynamo had become something no one had believed possible. Admiral Ramsay's plan, born in desperation beneath Dover Castle, had turned into a vast, living machine of coordination and courage. Each dawn brought more ships, more men, more miracles. Destroyers, minesweepers, ferries, lifeboats, trawlers, all moving in rhythm across the channel, guided by flares and searchlights, braving bombs and torpedoes to pull men from the edge of annihilation. The Royal Navy directed the effort with surgical precision. Signal lamps flashed across the horizon, messages relayed from ship to ship, each captain calculating tides and depth before running his vessel aground. Smaller craft ferried soldiers from the shallows to the larger ships waiting offshore. The beaches became a choreography of survival, men wading into the surf, helping each other aboard, cheering when a ship pulled away safely, falling silent when another went up in flames. Everywhere there was danger. German bombers appeared without warning, engines howling through the haze, their shadows sweeping across the sand like predatory birds. When they struck, the explosions lifted men into the air, tore boats apart, and left the sea black with oil and fire. Yet even in the midst of carnage, the lines held. When one man fell, another took his place. The Royal Air Force fought above them, invisible to most of those below. Squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes tangled with Messerschmitts in the clouds, their dogfights leaving white trails that twisted and vanished. Many soldiers cursed the RAF, believing they had been abandoned, not knowing that hundreds of pilots were dying out of sight to keep the skies just clear enough for the evacuation to continue. From the air, the scene below was like a scar across the coast, ships moving in and out through pillars of smoke, tracers flashing from the sea, thousands of men wading shoulder to shoulder in the surf. The scale of it defied imagination. In the first days, only a few thousand had been saved. Now, with every passing hour, the numbers climbed beyond hope: 50,000, 100,000, then 200,000. The impossible was becoming real. Amid the chaos, Acts of quiet heroism were everywhere. A captain of a trawler refused to leave until his decks were so packed that men were hanging from the rigging. A Royal Navy signalman worked his lamp until his hands bled, guiding ships through smoke so thick he could barely breathe. A priest moved among the wounded on the sand, murmuring prayers no one could hear over the bombs. On the fourth night, a sudden storm rolled in from the channel. The wind whipped up waves that tossed the small boats like driftwood. Yet the evacuation continued. Men clung to the sides of boats, drenched and freezing, singing to keep from breaking. "Home," one of them said through chattering teeth, "I can smell England from here." The men who made it across arrived in silence. In Dover and Ramsgate, nurses and volunteers waited with blankets, tea, and disbelief. The soldiers came ashore in every state, barefoot, burnt, starving, but alive. Some wept openly, others stared at the ground, unable to speak. They were greeted not as victors, but as survivors of a miracle. When Churchill received Ramsay's final reports, he could hardly believe the figures. By June 4, 338,226 men had been rescued, British, French, and Belgian alike. Against every calculation, against every expectation, more than 300,000 souls had been snatched from the jaws of defeat. In the House of Commons, Churchill rose to speak. His words, heavy with fatigue but bright with defiance, carried across the airwaves into homes still dark from blackout curtains. He did not call Dunkirk a victory, he called it deliverance. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. He paused, then added words that would echo through history. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. In that moment, Dunkirk ceased to be a retreat. It became a rebirth. A symbol of what courage looked like when stripped of everything else. For the soldiers who had stood on those beaches, the memory would never fade, the sound of engines overhead, the smell of burning oil, the faces of men they could not save. Yet in their endurance, in their refusal to break, Britain found its strength. The miracle of deliverance was not in the ships or the strategy. It was in the will of ordinary men who chose hope over despair, defiance over fear. From the ashes of Dunkirk rose a promise that though Europe had fallen, the fight for freedom had only just begun. The guns were still thundering in the north when the message came: France was collapsing. Dunkirk had been a miracle, yes, but it was a miracle born in retreat. While hundreds of thousands had escaped across the Channel, the heart of Europe was dying behind them. The German war machine, unbroken and relentless, now swept south toward Paris. The British had saved their army, but France, their greatest ally, was finished. Across the countryside, the roads were filled with defeat. Columns of refugees stretched for miles, pushing carts piled with children, blankets, and whatever possessions could be carried. Villages lay silent, churches half destroyed, their bells silenced by falling shells. German tanks rumbled through fields where farmers had once worked, and the air was thick with the stench of oil and smoke. In the skies above, the Luftwaffe reigned unchallenged. Every bridge, every convoy, every cluster of soldiers became a target. France's once proud army, the largest in Europe, was shattered and scattered, fighting without communication or command. The lines of defense, hastily drawn and redrawn, fell apart faster than they could be built. On June 10, 1940, the French government abandoned Paris. Ministers, clerks, and soldiers joined the rivers of civilians moving south. In the capital, shopkeepers boarded windows, and families locked doors they would never see again. The Eiffel Tower stood silent beneath a sky filled with smoke. For days later, the unthinkable happened. Paris fell. German motorized columns rolled through the Arc de Triomphe, the swastika flying above a city that had never known such humiliation. The conquerors posed for photographs on the boulevards, their boots echoing over cobblestones that had once been the heart of European culture. For the Parisians who remained, there was no fight left to give, only the sound of marching feet and the sight of black flags against the summer sun. From London, Churchill watched the reports in silence. He had pleaded with the French leaders to fight on, to withdraw their government to North Africa and continue the war from there. But France was exhausted, broken from within as much as from without. Defeatism had taken root long before the Germans crossed the border. On June 17, Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, addressed the French people in a trembling voice. "It is with a heavy heart," he said, "that I tell you we must stop fighting." 2 days later, in a railway carriage at Compiègne, the same spot where Germany had surrendered in 1918, the French delegation signed the armistice. The nation was cut in two, the north occupied by German troops, the south ruled by Pétain's collaborationist regime in Vichy. For Germany, it was triumph. For Britain, it was isolation. The continent now belonged to Hitler. From the Atlantic to the Black Sea, the Nazi flag flew over every capital. Italy had joined the Axis, and the Soviet Union, bound by its pact with Germany, stood aside. Only one country remained unconquered, one island nation staring across a narrow strip of sea that now separated freedom from tyranny. In Britain, the victory at Dunkirk was already fading beneath the weight of reality. The army had been saved, but it was without weapons, without vehicles, without allies. Britain's cities were preparing for air raids, invasions seemed inevitable. The same soldiers who had escaped France now dug trenches along England's coasts, turning their own homeland into a fortress. And yet, in that loneliness, something unbroken stirred. Dunkirk had shown that survival was possible, that courage could exist even in catastrophe. The defeat of France only hardened that resolve. If the rest of Europe had fallen, Britain would fight alone. In Parliament, Churchill spoke with the gravity of a man who understood the magnitude of what lay ahead. "The Battle of France is over," he said. "I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." His words carried across a nation bracing for siege. In every town, church bells were silenced, they would ring again only to warn of invasion. Blackout curtains covered every window. Children were evacuated from London. The people listened to the distant drone of planes and waited for what would come next. Dunkirk had been deliverance, but not redemption. The soldiers who had been pulled from the beaches now faced the grim truth: they had escaped not from war, but into its next chapter. France had fallen, Europe lay in darkness, and across the Channel, the fires of Dunkirk still burned, a reminder that survival was not victory, but the beginning of defiance. For Britain, the miracle of Dunkirk was both a promise and a burden. They had been spared, but only to stand alone. And as the world watched the swastika rise over Paris, one truth became clear: the fate of freedom now rested in the hands of those who had fled the beaches, and in the courage of a nation that refused to surrender. In the days after Dunkirk, Britain felt as if it had looked into the abyss and stepped back. The news that more than 300,000 men had been brought home spread like a pulse of life through a country that had been holding its breath for weeks. People gathered around radios, straining to hear the latest count. Every ship that docked in Dover or Ramsgate brought not just soldiers, but the proof that the island still had a heartbeat. Across the Channel, France was gone, and Hitler's armies stood unchallenged on the continent. Yet for the British people, Dunkirk was not the end. It was the beginning of something they had not felt in years: a hard, clear faith in themselves. They called it the Dunkirk spirit. It began quietly, in the fishing towns where the boats returned. Crowds stood on the piers, cheering through tears as men stumbled ashore, too tired to raise their heads. Nurses wrapped them in blankets, children handed them mugs of tea that trembled in their small hands. For days, trains carried the soldiers inland to hospitals, barracks, and fields. People leaned from bridges to wave as they passed. There were no speeches, no bands. Only gratitude and awe. Newspapers carried photographs of the evacuation, men packed shoulder to shoulder on the decks of trawlers, destroyers moving through fire, columns of weary soldiers marching through Kent. The headlines called it a miracle of deliverance. Yet beneath the celebration was the understanding that what had been saved was not victory, but the chance to continue the fight. Churchill's speech in the House of Commons had captured it perfectly. He refused to disguise the danger ahead. He warned that wars were not won by evacuations, that what had happened at Dunkirk was survival, not triumph. But then his voice had hardened, carrying the promise that Britain would never yield. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender. Those words burned into the national consciousness. They turned fear into defiance. In pubs and factories, in schools and on farms, people repeated them like a prayer. Posters appeared on walls showing the cliffs of Dover beneath the words, "We can take it." The beaches that might soon face invasion became symbols of determination. The Dunkirk spirit was not born of denial, it was born of endurance. The British people knew what was coming, the bombings, the blackouts, the sirens that would wail across London night after night. But they also knew that if an army could be saved from the jaws of destruction, then perhaps a nation could too. Factories worked through the night, producing rifles, aircraft, and ammunition to replace what had been left behind in France. Mechanics patched up old Spitfires and Hurricanes for the battle they knew was coming. Volunteers joined the Home Guard, drilling with broomsticks and wooden rifles until real weapons arrived. On the coast, soldiers and civilians alike built defenses, laying mines and digging trenches in the sand. The nation was turning itself into a fortress. Even in Parliament, where despair had once whispered in corridors, a new resolve took hold. Ministers who had spoken privately of peace now found themselves swept along by the current of unity. Britain would fight, alone if it had to, together if it could. For the soldiers who had been rescued, the spirit of Dunkirk carried a different weight. Many felt guilt for having left comrades behind, for surviving when others had not. They had seen the worst of war, men drowning under burning oil, friends disappearing in smoke. Yet even they spoke of a strange pride, not in victory, but in a sheer act of endurance. They had faced the impossible and lived. One private wrote to his mother from a hospital bed, "We left our guns, our tanks, everything. But we brought back our spirit." The phrase caught on. It spread through newspapers, through the speeches of ministers and the sermons of priests. Dunkirk's spirit became shorthand for something deeper, the belief that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to give in to it. When the first German bombs fell on London that autumn, people remembered the beaches. They remembered the men who had stood in water up to their chests waiting for rescue, the civilians who had crossed the channel in fishing boats, the pilots who had fought unseen above the clouds. They remembered that hope could survive even when surrounded by fire. Dunkirk had been a military disaster turned into a moral victory. It did not end the war, but it gave the British people the one thing they needed most, the conviction that they could face anything. In the years to come, the words Dunkirk spirit would be invoked in every crisis, as a measure of endurance, a reminder of what ordinary people can do when history leaves them no choice but to be extraordinary. For now, in the summer of 1940, that spirit hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. The nation was battered, alone, and unarmed, but it was unbroken. And as the lights of Europe went out, one small island, hardened by loss and lifted by faith, stood ready to fight on. They wrote their words in the margins of notebooks, on the backs of ration cards, even on scraps of torn maps. Some were never sent, others found decades later in attics and archives, fragments of a moment when the world stood on the edge of defeat and ordinary men became witnesses to history. Dunkirk was not a story of generals and strategies, but of individuals caught between survival and surrender, between despair and endurance. A private from the Royal Warwickshire Regiment began his letter with trembling hands. "We are waiting on the beach. The sea is full of wrecks, and the sky never stops screaming. The sand shakes when the bombs hit. We dig little holes and lie in them, pretending it's safety. Some men pray, others curse. I just want to see home again." For many, that word, home, became a kind of talisman. They could see England on clear days, a faint blue line across the horizon. The distance was cruel, close enough to dream of yet unreachable without a miracle. One officer described the moment he realized the truth: the channel is narrow, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles. We were ghosts already, waiting to vanish. The diaries spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and the peculiar silence that comes when men run out of fear. They wrote about comrades sharing the last of their water, about soldiers giving up their places on boats for the wounded, about the strange calm that came when there was nothing left to do but wait. A French soldier, trapped in the ruins of Bergs, scribbled in his journal, "We hold so the others may live. We hear the ships leaving. Every engine sound is a prayer." On the beaches, time lost meaning. Days blurred into nights marked only by the flash of explosions and the faint sound of hymns or songs rising from scattered groups of soldiers. Some men stared blankly at the sea, others stared at the sky. The smell of salt mixed with smoke, and the wind carried the cries of the wounded out to sea. A sergeant recalled the faces of the men around him. "We stopped being soldiers, we were just men in the sand. No ranks, no orders, just hands reaching out to pull each other up when the bombs came." Amid the horror, there were moments of kindness that burned brighter for their rarity. A medical orderly described carrying a wounded man through the surf under machine gun fire. "He kept apologizing," he wrote, saying he was sorry to be heavy. "I told him to shut up and hold on." They made it to a small boat. Hours later, when the orderly was pulled aboard a destroyer, he looked for the man, and found only an empty stretcher floating in the water. For every voice that spoke of survival, another vanished with the tide. Letters washed up on English beaches days later, smudged and illegible. Some bore only fragments: "Tell mother I am safe," or "We are still here," and nothing more. Meanwhile, across the channel, civilians in England followed the news in disbelief. Radio bulletins spoke cautiously of an evacuation in progress, never revealing how desperate it truly was. Families waited by the wireless, hands clasped, whispering the names of sons and brothers. In seaside towns like Dover and Ramsgate, people climbed cliffs and rooftops to watch the horizon, mistaking the smoke of battle for distant storm clouds. One woman in Sussex wrote in her diary, "We bake bread and keep the kettle on. It's all we can do." The sea feels different now, as if it's carrying ghosts. When the first survivors arrived, their silence said more than words. They looked hollow, sunburned, blackened with soot. Mothers who had prayed for glory met sons who could no longer speak of what they had seen. One soldier, interviewed by a war correspondent, simply said, "I was afraid. But everyone was, and somehow we stayed." The correspondence from Dunkirk reveals not just the scale of suffering, but the texture of it, the small, human moments that exist even in catastrophe. A note found years later in a discarded helmet read, "If I don't make it, tell them I tried to keep smiling." In the end, their voices, scrawled in ink, whispered in letters, recorded in trembling hands, became the heartbeat of Dunkirk. They were the fragments of men who had stood in hell and chosen to hope anyway. And when those words finally crossed the channel, carried home in envelopes, memory, and silence, they became more than letters. They became proof that the human spirit, even buried in sand and fire, still found a way to speak. The sea was both savior and executioner. For every ship that brought men home from Dunkirk, another was claimed by the depths. It was the Royal Navy that bore the heaviest burden, its sailors guiding the convoys through smoke, wreckage, and fire, knowing that every crossing might be their last. From the first hours of Operation Dynamo, the Navy had been the backbone of the evacuation. While the soldiers waited helpless on the beaches, it was the destroyers, minesweepers, and patrol boats that faced the brunt of the Luftwaffe's fury. They were the lifeline, battered, bombed, and burning, but never breaking. The channel, calm in its appearance, had become a corridor of death. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies, and every ship that ventured out was an open target. The German pilots came in low, their engines screaming as bombs fell with terrifying precision. Stukas dived straight into the ship's shadows, the howl of their sirens echoing across the waves before the explosions hit. On the second day, the HMS Wakeful, a destroyer already filled with hundreds of rescued men, was caught in one such attack. 2 torpedoes struck her in quick succession, splitting the ship in half. Within minutes, she was gone. Of the nearly 700 men aboard, only a few dozen were pulled from the oily sea. The survivors clung to floating debris, watching as their brothers vanished beneath the dark water. Nearby, the HMS Grenade lay moored at Dunkirk's mole, taking on soldiers under constant bombardment. A sudden air raid turned the harbor into chaos. 2 bombs struck Grenade amidships, igniting her magazines. Flames shot from her decks, and sailors threw themselves into the water to escape. She burned until her ammunition detonated, the explosion echoing like thunder across the shore. The losses were relentless. Destroyers, transports, even hospital ships went down. The HMS Basilisk, Keith, Havant, and Grafton all fell within days. Minesweepers were torn apart by bombs as they cleared the routes for others to follow. Every ship lost meant hundreds more stranded on the beaches. And yet, they kept going back. The men of the Royal Navy did not have the luxury of despair. Orders came, and they obeyed. Crews slept in their clothes, ate cold rations between air raids, and worked the engines until their hands blistered. When ships came under attack, damage control parties fought fires with buckets of seawater, patching holes with anything that would hold. On more than one occasion, sailors used their own bodies to plug ruptured pipes, refusing to leave their stations even as the decks burned around them. One petty officer from the destroyer HMS Sabre wrote later, "We went in until the paint peeled from the heat of the fires. The beaches looked alive, moving, shifting, like an ant's nest, but those were men. We just kept filling the ship until there was no room left to stand." The dangers were not only from above. The channel was laced with mines and littered with wreckage. Pilots had to navigate through floating debris and the corpses of men and horses. Every night, the sea carried the wreckage of war, empty life rafts, scorched helmets, half-burned letters, back toward England. The tides themselves seemed unwilling to let go. Despite it all, the Navy's precision held. The crews learned to move under the cover of darkness, timing their runs with the tides. Smaller vessels guided the larger ones through the shallows, often using nothing but a lantern and intuition. It was seamanship born of desperation and genius. From his command center beneath Dover Castle, Admiral Bertram Ramsay received constant reports of ships lost, of crews missing, of miracles achieved. He never slept more than an hour at a time, coordinating every movement through the night. His voice, calm and deliberate, became the heartbeat of the operation. "Send another destroyer," he would say. send another minesweeper. When told that the Luftwaffe was destroying ships faster than they could be replaced, he simply replied, "Then we will send what we have left." By the end of the evacuation, the numbers defied belief. Over 860 vessels of every kind had taken part, from battleships to fishing smacks. Royal Navy destroyers alone evacuated more than 100,000 men, many making 5 or 6 crossings through constant attack. The sailors did not think of themselves as heroes. They were tired, filthy, and numb. Some wept when they reached port, others turned their ships around and went straight back into the smoke. A few never made the return journey. When the last ship left Dunkirk, the sea was littered with the evidence of their sacrifice, the twisted remains of hulls, the drifting lifebelts, the oil-slicked feathers of dead seabirds. The channel had become a graveyard, but also a symbol, proof that courage could still hold the line when all else failed. The Navy had done what seemed impossible. Against the full force of the German army and air power, they had carried a nation's sons home. The cost was terrible, the losses immense, but the will of those men, sailors, officers, volunteers, burned brighter than the fires that consumed their ships. In the quiet that followed, Ramsay finally sent one last message to London: Operation Dynamo complete. 338,226 men evacuated. God save them all. The miracle of Dunkirk belonged to many, to the soldiers on the sand, the civilians who crossed the sea, and the pilots who fought in the clouds, but its heart was forged in salt water and steel, in the men who went down to the sea again and again, until none were left to save. They were the ones who stayed behind when the last British ships turned toward home. The men of the French army, exhausted, half-starved, and cut off from command, became the forgotten shield that covered the final moments of Dunkirk. For the British Expeditionary Force, their evacuation was over. For the French soldiers, the real battle had only begun. In the final days of May 1940, the perimeter around Dunkirk was closing in fast. German artillery pounded the beaches day and night. The British lines had already begun to pull back toward the sea, crowding the docks and beaches where the rescue operation was reaching its end. But behind them, thousands of French soldiers were still fighting, the last barrier between the Germans and the fragile miracle of evacuation. The French divisions that remained had been battered beyond recognition. The 68th Infantry Division, the 32nd, and fragments of the 12th Motorized Division held the line from Bergs to Gravelines. Many units were reduced to a handful of men, their uniforms torn, weapons scavenged from fallen comrades. Their orders were simple and devastating: hold the enemy, no matter the cost. They fought without air cover, without supplies, and often without hope. German tanks pressed closer each hour, and every field gun or machine gun that fired back drew immediate retaliation. The sky above Dunkirk burned red from constant bombardment. Yet the French kept fighting, knowing that each minute bought another life saved across the channel. One French officer later wrote, "We knew the British ships were still loading. We could see the smoke from their funnels. We could hear the engines. We said nothing. We fought, and we waited for the end." By June 2nd, the last British troops had been evacuated. The Royal Navy began pulling away, leaving only a few vessels to pick up stragglers. On the beaches, tens of thousands of French soldiers still stood waiting for orders that would never come. Many believed the evacuation would continue for them. But the British command, under impossible pressure and with resources exhausted, made the agonizing decision to end the operation. The final British ship left that night, its decks crowded with men who refused to look back. When dawn came, the French were alone. The Germans struck hard and fast. At the village of Bergs, surrounded and outnumbered, the French 12th Infantry Regiment held their ground until the ammunition ran out. Entire companies were wiped out in hand-to-hand combat. At Gravelines, French artillerymen fired their last shells and then destroyed their guns rather than surrender them intact. Those who survived the onslaught fell back toward the sea, where there were no more ships waiting. Some tried to wade into the surf, waving at the empty horizon. Others dropped their weapons and waited in silence as the German tanks rolled past. Thousands were captured, marched east into captivity that would last 5 long years. For many, bitterness set in quickly. There was anger toward Britain, not for the evacuation itself, but for what it had symbolized: salvation for one ally, abandonment for another. In French newspapers and whispers among the ranks, words like betrayal began to circulate. Yet even amid resentment, most understood the grim truth: the British had done what they had to do. Without Dunkirk, there would have been no army left to continue the war. The French soldiers had not been forsaken, they had been sacrificed by circumstance. Among the British troops who had escaped, guilt was a constant companion. Soldiers wrote home about the faces they'd seen on the beaches, Frenchmen waving them on, shouting encouragement, even as the last boats pulled away. One British corporal remembered a French sergeant who saluted him as he boarded a trawler. "Go, my friend," the Frenchman had said. "We will keep the Germans busy for you." Hours later, that same beach was overrun. When the war ended years later, survivors would remember those final hours as a mixture of honor and tragedy. The French rearguard had bought the time needed to save an entire army. Without their stand, Operation Dynamo would have been a massacre. Yet their courage was buried beneath the triumph of British deliverance, their sacrifice overshadowed by the miracle they made possible. In the aftermath, France fell, its government surrendering to the Germans and establishing the collaborationist Vichy regime. Many of the French soldiers captured at Dunkirk would spend the rest of the war in prison camps, their names unspoken, their deeds forgotten. But some refused to accept defeat. A few escaped captivity, joining Charles de Gaulle's Free French forces, vowing to fight until France itself was free again. For them, Dunkirk was not an ending but a beginning, a wound that would drive them through the long years of occupation and resistance. They had stood alone in the final hours, not for glory, not for victory, but for duty. When the guns finally fell silent and the beaches were quiet again, the sands of Dunkirk were strewn with the remnants of their stand: helmets, rifles, tattered flags marked Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. The French rearguard had fought knowing they would not be saved. They had held the line so others could live. And though history would call Dunkirk a British miracle, it was written, in part, in French blood. They began the march long before anyone called it Dunkirk. It started in the fields of Belgium and northern France, where the green spring countryside was torn apart by steel and fire. The roads were crowded with soldiers, trucks, refugees, and the endless sound of engines that could never outrun what was behind them. It wasn't an organized retreat, it was survival in motion. For the men of the British Expeditionary Force and their French allies, the road to Dunkirk was a road through chaos. Columns stretched for miles, winding through narrow lanes lined with burning villages. German aircraft circled like vultures, their engines droning overhead. Every so often, the Stukas would dive, their sirens shrieking, scattering men and civilians into the ditches. The sound of those dives, that rising scream followed by the dull, cracking explosion, would stay with survivors for the rest of their lives. A British corporal described it later: you could tell the difference between a shell and a bomb. A shell gave you time to think. A bomb just erased where you were. The German blitzkrieg was unlike anything the Allies had ever faced. Tanks moved faster than communication lines, slicing through defenses before orders could even reach the front. Columns of armored vehicles appear out of nowhere, cutting supply lines and ambushing convoys. Bridges were blown up behind retreating units, sometimes with their own men still on them, just to slow the enemy. The soldiers walked and fought in exhaustion. They carried wounded comrades on makeshift stretchers, rifles slung over their shoulders, boots caked with mud and blood. The heat of the early summer was oppressive, the air thick with dust and smoke. The men barely slept, they moved by day and dug in by night, never sure if they'd live to see morning. But the soldiers weren't alone. Behind them came the civilians, the great migration of war. Entire families left their homes with what they could carry: suitcases, chickens, children, a few photographs wrapped in cloth. Carts piled with furniture creaked along behind exhausted horses. Mothers carried babies and led toddlers by the hand, stepping over the debris of war: broken helmets, abandoned rifles, shattered glass. One French farmer, his wife beside him, told a passing British officer, "We go west." "Where do you go?" The officer, covered in dust, could only answer, "To the sea." Every road seemed to lead there. The word Dunkirk passed from mouth to mouth, whispered like a prayer. It was said the Royal Navy was there, that ships were waiting. It became a beacon for the lost. For every soldier who had a weapon, there were 10 civilians walking beside him, hoping the sea might offer a way out of the nightmare. But the road was never safe. German reconnaissance planes spotted retreating columns and called down bombers. The attacks were merciless. Convoys of trucks carrying the wounded were obliterated in seconds. Those who survived dragged the injured to the roadside and kept walking. The smell of burning oil and flesh hung in the air for miles. In the confusion, units became scattered. Commanders lost contact with headquarters, orders contradicted one another or came too late to matter. In some places, British and French forces turned on each other in anger, accusing one another of abandonment. The Allied front had ceased to exist. It was now a mass of small, desperate groups, each fighting its own war to stay alive. At Arras, a brief counterattack gave the men a glimpse of hope. British tanks struck at the German flanks, momentarily slowing the advance. But it was too little, too late. The Germans recovered quickly, encircling the Allies once more. The retreat resumed, more frantic than before. By late May, the truth began to sink in among the officers: France was lost. The government in Paris was already collapsing, and communications with high command were breaking down. The only order that made sense anymore was to reach the coast. General Lord Gort, commanding the British Expeditionary Force, gave the instruction that would define the rest of the campaign: fall back to Dunkirk. Those words spread like a grim prophecy through the ranks. The men didn't know what waited for them there, only that it was their last chance. The journey was hell. Soldiers slept in barns, under bridges, or not at all. Water was scarce, food scarcer still. Many shared what little they had with the civilians who followed them. One French lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We are ghosts already. We walk, and the earth burns behind us." At night, the roads glowed with the fires of retreat. Villages burned to deny shelter to the enemy. Horses collapsed in the fields, engines sputtered and died for lack of fuel. And still, they marched. Every sunrise brought them closer to the sea, but also closer to despair. When they finally reached the outskirts of Dunkirk, they expected safety. Instead, they found another kind of battlefield: beaches crowded with men, ships burning offshore, and the air alive with gunfire. But to the soldiers who had crossed half of France under fire, even that chaos looked like deliverance. Behind them, France continued to burn. Commanders who had once spoken of counterattacks now spoke only of surrender. The war that had begun in optimism had turned into flight. And for those who survived the road to Dunkirk, the memory of that retreat, the endless march through fire and smoke, would never fade. It was not just a withdrawal. It was the slow unraveling of an army, of a nation, of an entire world order. But in the dust and the blood of that road, something else endured, the stubborn will to live long enough to reach the sea, and the hope, however faint, that salvation might come on the tide. In the spring of 1940, the British government stood on a knife's edge. France was collapsing, Belgium was lost, and nearly the entire British expeditionary force was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk. In Whitehall, the air was heavy with the smell of cigarette smoke and fear. Every hour brought new reports of ships sunk, men missing, the line tightening. And yet, amid the uncertainty, one man refused to bend. Winston Churchill, only weeks into his premiership, faced the darkest decision of his career, whether to fight on or seek peace. The War Cabinet met almost daily in the Cabinet Room at 10, Downing Street. The walls shook faintly when bombs fell across the Channel. Around the long table sat men divided by exhaustion and dread: Neville Chamberlain, still smarting from his fall from power; Lord Halifax, Foreign Secretary and advocate for negotiation; Clement Attlee, the quiet Labour leader who understood that compromise with tyranny was no peace at all. Churchill, his voice hoarse from sleepless nights, listened to them all, then rejected despair outright. The situation was catastrophic. By late May, more than 350,000 Allied troops were surrounded at Dunkirk. The French front had disintegrated, and the British Army, the heart of the Empire's defense, faced total destruction. Without that army, Britain could not continue the war. The Navy and Air Force alone would not be enough to defend the island. For a few days, the possibility that Britain might follow France into surrender hung unspoken in the air like a curse. Lord Halifax suggested exploring mediation through Mussolini. The Italian dictator, not yet at war with Britain, might act as a go-between with Hitler. Perhaps, Halifax reasoned, the terms would be lenient. Perhaps the British Empire could survive if it accepted German control of Europe. "We must consider every avenue to save what remains," he said. The words fell like lead across the table. Churchill rose slowly, his eyes dark beneath the brim of his hat. "If this Long Island story of ours is to end," he said quietly, "let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." It was not rhetoric, it was defiance. His conviction, raw and unpolished, struck something deep in the men around him. Still, the gamble was immense. Churchill had staked the nation's survival on Operation Dynamo, trusting that the Navy could pull off a miracle under fire. Reports from Dover were grim: destroyers sunk, beaches bombed, ships overcrowded to the point of capsizing. Even so, Churchill ordered the evacuation to continue. Every ship that could float was to cross the Channel: ferries, trawlers, yachts, even pleasure boats. "We must bring them home," he told Admiral Ramsay. "Every man we can." At the same time, Churchill had to fight another battle, not against the Germans, but against defeatism at home. The public did not yet know the full scope of the disaster. Newspapers carried vague headlines about heavy fighting in France. In the Commons, MPs whispered about peace talks. Churchill understood that if Dunkirk failed, the calls for negotiation would be irresistible. Britain's morale, already fragile, would shatter. He crafted his speeches carefully, turning fear into fire. On May 28, when the crisis was at its height, he addressed the nation: "We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end." Each word struck like a hammer. He was not promising victory, only endurance. It was exactly what the British needed to hear. Behind closed doors, Churchill's gamble looked almost reckless. If the Navy lost its ships, if the Luftwaffe destroyed the evacuation fleet, Britain would not only lose its army, it would lose its hope. Some in his government feared that defiance would lead to annihilation. Others believed surrender would destroy the soul of the nation. Churchill chose the harder path. He told his private secretary that the only option was to fight on, even if invasion came. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be," he dictated, pacing the room. "We shall fight in the fields and in the streets." The words were meant for Parliament, but they were also a promise to himself. When the evacuation succeeded beyond all expectation, more than 338,000 men saved, Churchill did not allow celebration. He refused to call it a victory. "Wars are not won by evacuations," he reminded the Commons. But in his eyes, Dunkirk was more than survival, it was the rebirth of British resolve. The nation had looked defeat in the face and chosen to fight anyway. Had the evacuation failed, history might have turned differently. The British army would have been destroyed, the government forced to negotiate, and Hitler's empire might have stretched unbroken from the Atlantic to Moscow. The free world, as Churchill later said, would have sunk into the abyss of a new dark age. Instead, his gamble had held. The army lived. The people believed. And though the war would grow darker still, the line had been drawn. Britain would stand alone, not because it was strong, but because it refused to bow. In the dim light of the war room, Churchill lit another cigar, leaned over the map of France, and murmured to no one in particular, "Now we shall see what we are made of." The smoke curled toward the ceiling as the bombs continued to fall across the channel. His nation was wounded, his army battered, but the will of its leader burned like a beacon through the fog. And from that defiance was born the spirit that would carry Britain through the storm. Dunkirk burned like a vision from hell. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid taste of metal, the sky, a flickering orange dome of fire. From the beaches to the harbor, everything that could burn was already burning: oil depots, warehouses, fishing boats, homes. The city that had once been a quiet French port was now a furnace, sacrificed so that others might escape. The bombardment never stopped. Every few minutes, the deep thunder of German artillery rolled in from the east, followed by the high-pitched scream of incoming shells. Each explosion tore another hole in the city, sending showers of debris and glass cascading into the streets. The Luftwaffe swept overhead in waves, their bombers moving in precise formations. When the sirens began their mechanical howl, there was nowhere left to hide. The harbor was a graveyard. Ships lay half-submerged, blackened skeletons surrounded by oil fires. Destroyers that had once gleamed with fresh paint were now rusted and twisted from the heat. The wooden mole, the makeshift pier where tens of thousands of soldiers had been evacuated, was cratered and splintered, yet men still crowded it, waiting for rescue. Flames from burning fuel tanks reflected on the waves, turning the channel blood-red under the night sky. A British soldier later described it: "The whole place glowed. You could read by the light of the fires. The sea hissed where the oil burned, and you could smell it for miles. Everywhere there were bodies, soldiers, sailors, civilians, lying where they had fallen. Some were buried in the sand, others floating in the surf, their faces lit by the flames. Those still alive moved through the ruins like ghosts, coughing in the smoke, their clothes and skin blackened with soot. Water was scarce, clean air, even rarer. The civilian population of Dunkirk suffered the most. Many had refused to leave their homes when the evacuation began, clinging to the hope that the fighting would pass them by. But the war came for them all the same. Families huddled in basements while the city above collapsed. When the bombardments hit the old quarter, entire streets vanished in moments. A young mother was seen running through the rubble, clutching her child beneath the burning church steeple. Others simply disappeared beneath the waves of fire and debris. For the Allied soldiers still waiting to be rescued, the horror blurred into numbness. Days and nights became indistinguishable beneath the constant smoke. The sound of bombs, the cries for help, the crackle of fire, it all became one unending rhythm. When the wind shifted, it carried the smell of salt, oil, and burning flesh. The men stopped flinching when the next shell landed nearby. They had already seen too much to fear what came next. The harbor itself was targeted again and again. The Germans wanted to destroy what remained of the evacuation route. Every time a ship pulled away loaded with soldiers, the Luftwaffe came roaring down to destroy it. The explosions were so constant that the sea seemed to boil. Even as the piers collapsed and the water filled with wreckage, small boats continued to push through, weaving between burning ships to reach the stranded men. Amid the destruction, the courage of those who stayed shone through the smoke. Sailors worked knee-deep in fire to unload wounded men. Priests moved through the rubble, giving last rites to the dying. A nurse who refused to leave her patients was later found dead among them, her hands still folded in prayer. By the fourth day, Dunkirk was no longer a city, it was a ruin. The cathedral had lost its roof, the main square was unrecognizable, and the docks had disappeared beneath wreckage. The once bustling port had become a silhouette of twisted cranes and smoldering ships. The Germans continued their bombardment until there was almost nothing left to destroy. And yet, through it all, the evacuation went on. From the inferno, men still emerged from the smoke, wading through burning oil to reach the rescue boats. Every explosion that lit up the horizon seemed to drive them faster, as if the flames themselves were pushing them toward survival. A naval officer watching from offshore wrote in his log, "The city burns behind them. Every building is gone. But still they come, through fire, through water, walking out of hell toward home." When the final ships left Dunkirk, the fires were still raging. The last shells fell into the harbor, scattering sparks across the black water. Those who escaped looked back from the decks and saw the city glowing in the distance, a dying light against the dark horizon. Some saluted, others wept. Dunkirk had been saved, but at an unbearable price. The harbor that had given life to an army was now ashes. The civilians who had once lived there were gone, their homes reduced to rubble. The air would remain thick with smoke for weeks, and the sea itself would carry the stench of war for months to come. Historians would later call it the miracle of Dunkirk, but for those who had seen the city burn, the word miracle felt hollow. They knew that what had happened there was not divine intervention, but the endurance of men who refused to yield. Dunkirk was not merely a place on a map, it was a sacrifice, a city consumed so that others might live. And when the flames finally died and the last embers faded into the channel mist, the silence that followed was as haunting as the fire itself. Dunkirk was gone. But in its ashes, the will of a nation still burned. When the last ships left Dunkirk, the headlines spoke of deliverance. The newspapers called it a miracle, the radio spoke of courage, and Churchill himself gave the words that would define it: "We shall fight on the beaches." But beneath the roar of applause and the relief of survival, there lingered a truth that everyone knew but few dared to say aloud: Dunkirk had been a retreat. A brilliant, desperate, necessary retreat, but a retreat all the same. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped annihilation, yes, but it had done so at a terrible cost. The army had been saved, but its weapons had not. Almost everything the British had brought to France now lay scattered and smoldering across the fields and roads between the Channel and the Maginot Line. Thousands of guns, vehicles, and tanks were left behind or destroyed. Warehouses full of ammunition, fuel, and supplies were abandoned to the Germans. On the beaches themselves, entire rows of trucks and artillery had been driven into the surf to prevent their capture. The air was filled with the sound of engines drowning in salt water. Soldiers who had fought through exhaustion and terror to reach the sea were ordered to throw away their rifles before boarding the boats. A few men disobeyed, trying to carry their weapons aboard, only to be told, "No room. Leave it. You'll get another in England." But there weren't enough rifles in England. In the days following the evacuation, the grim scale of the loss became clear. Nearly 85,000 vehicles, 700 tanks, and 500,000 tons of supplies had been abandoned. The British army that returned home was barely an army at all, 338,000 men armed with almost nothing. When they disembarked in Dover, soldiers stood in line to receive cups of tea, blankets, and whatever rifles could be scraped from armories. Many were still in the same tattered uniforms they had worn for weeks. A private wrote in his diary, "We came back with nothing but our skin and our spirit." It wasn't a boast, it was an epitaph for the campaign. In London, Churchill understood how fragile the moment was. The victory of survival could easily turn into the despair of exposure. Britain was now alone, its army unarmed, its allies defeated. The factories worked day and night to replace what had been lost, but the math was brutal. The Germans had more tanks in one division than Britain had in the entire country. Across the Channel, Hitler's army stood at the edge of the sea. France had fallen. The swastika now flew over Paris. The next logical step was clear: invasion. Britain braced for it. Beaches were mined, cliffs fortified, bridges rigged with explosives. In the parks of London, mock defenses were built out of sandbags and scrap metal. The Home Guard drilled with broomsticks and hunting rifles, because there were not enough weapons to go around. And yet, even as the reality darkened, the story of Dunkirk took on a different life, one shaped not by military truth, but by human need. The Ministry of Information began crafting the message that would sustain the nation. Dunkirk was not a failure, but a triumph of courage and unity. Posters appeared across cities showing soldiers stepping from the waves, faces hardened but unbroken. Newsreels called the evacuation the miracle of deliverance. The term Dunkirk spirit entered the national vocabulary, a phrase that captured not strategy or victory, but something more vital: the will to endure. It was propaganda, yes, but it was also hope, and Britain needed it desperately. The people who had stood in blackout darkness, who had waited for news of their sons, needed to believe that the sacrifice had meant something. The soldiers who had crawled through fire and surf needed to believe they had not simply fled, that their retreat had been an act of defiance. In Parliament, Churchill balanced honesty with inspiration. He never pretended Dunkirk had been a triumph, but he gave it dignity. Wars are not won by evacuations, he told the Commons, but there was a victory inside that deliverance, a victory of spirit. His words framed the retreat not as the end of something, but as the beginning of resistance. Behind the speeches and headlines, the military reality was dire. Britain had lost most of its heavy weapons. It would take months before new tanks and aircraft could roll off the production lines. The Royal Navy had suffered heavy damage. The Royal Air Force had lost scores of planes defending the skies over Dunkirk. Hitler now controlled the continent, and the Channel was all that stood between him and conquest. Historians would later call it one of the greatest paradoxes of the war, that a near-total defeat could become a symbol of resilience. But perhaps that was the true miracle of Dunkirk, not the evacuation itself, but the transformation of disaster into determination. The men who had fled through fire and smoke became the foundation of a new army. The small boats that had braved the Channel became emblems of courage. The empty-handed soldiers who returned home stood as proof that even in defeat, a nation's soul could remain unbroken. One pilot, watching the last of the smoke fade from the coast of France, wrote in his logbook, "We have left behind everything but our hope. If that is enough, then we may yet survive." In the summer of 1940, that hope was all Britain had. But it would be enough. From the ashes of Dunkirk, the shadow of defeat became the light that would carry them through the darkest year of the war. They came home in silence. The soldiers who had endured the beaches of Dunkirk stepped off the ships into the grey light of England, wet, hollow-eyed, wrapped in blankets and disbelief. The docks at Dover, Margate, and Ramsgate were crowded with nurses, volunteers, and officers trying to keep order. There were no bands, no parades, only the sound of boots on wet wood and the quiet sobs of relief. Some of the men kissed the ground as soon as they stepped ashore. Others stood staring at the cliffs, blinking as though they were looking at ghosts. They had escaped the inferno, but the war still clung to them, the smell of oil and smoke in their clothes, the sound of bombs echoing in their dreams. Many hadn't slept in days. Their faces were burned by sun and salt, their hands trembling as they clutched mugs of tea offered by women in uniform. The volunteers called them heroes, but most of the soldiers didn't feel like heroes. They had left comrades behind, men who would never see home again. The guilt hung over them like a second shadow. "I should have stayed," one private whispered, staring at the sea. "I should have been the one still out there." Others tried to push the thoughts away. They laughed too loudly, ate too quickly, and avoided talking about what they had seen. But at night, the beaches came back to them, the burning ships, the screaming engines, the faces disappearing beneath the waves. For their families, the return was both joy and heartbreak. Mothers ran to embrace sons they had already buried in their minds. Wives clutched men who had aged a decade in 10 days. In villages across Britain, church bells rang for the first time since the invasion of France, and yet behind every celebration there was an ache, the knowledge that thousands more had not come back. The newspapers carried the story with reverence and restraint. Photographs of exhausted soldiers stepping from boats appeared beneath headlines that spoke of deliverance and faith. "Home again, our boys return from the jaws of death," read one. The radio spoke in calm, measured tones, describing the miracle unfolding across the channel. The true scale of the horror was left unspoken. Britain needed hope more than truth. Film reels captured the moment with the same careful balance, soldiers smiling weakly at the camera, children waving flags, ships gliding into port beneath a cloudless sky. The footage was grainy, the colors black and white, but to those who watched it, it seemed like the world had briefly been restored. Yet beneath the surface, the trauma ran deep. The men who had survived the evacuation carried more than physical exhaustion. They carried the weight of loss, the shock of defeat, and the uncertainty of what would come next. Some could not bring themselves to talk about Dunkirk for years. Others spoke of it only in fragments, the sand, the smoke, the waiting. They called it hell with no horizon. Still, Britain changed in those days. Something hardened in the nation's spirit, a quiet unity that would define the years to come. Before Dunkirk, the war had seemed distant, a European conflict fought on foreign soil. After Dunkirk, it was personal. Every family felt it. Every town had sent a son, a brother, a father who had walked through fire and returned. The phrase "we were all in it together" became more than a slogan. It was truth. Factories redoubled their efforts. Women took up tools and munitions plants, replacing the weapons that had been left behind in France. Communities gathered food, fuel, and clothes for the soldiers returning to service. Even in the poorest districts of London, where the Blitz would soon begin, people opened their doors to evacuees and refugees. Churchill saw it clearly. He told his aides, "The nation is united as never before. Dunkirk has bound us by blood and fire." He understood that what had happened on those beaches was more than a military event, it was a rebirth of purpose. The British people had looked disaster in the face and refused to break. Among the returning soldiers, camaraderie replaced despair. In barracks and camps, they joked about their escape, calling it the Great Swim or Hitler's gift. Beneath the humor, though, was the quiet knowledge of what they had lost. One man wrote to his wife, "I came back without my rifle, without my pride, but I came back. That's enough for now." The government distributed food and tobacco, and slowly the soldiers were reassigned, rearmed, and retrained. New weapons arrived from the factories, old uniforms were patched and pressed. What had been an army of survivors began to turn into an army of defenders. The war had taken almost everything from them, but it had left one thing behind, the will to fight again. And so Britain, scarred but alive, prepared for the next storm. The men who had stood in the surf at Dunkirk would soon stand on the cliffs of Dover and the airfields of Kent, facing the Luftwaffe in the skies. They no longer believed in miracles. But they believed in themselves. The long road home from Dunkirk had not ended at the docks, it stretched through every village, every factory, every heart that refused to surrender. The soldiers had come back to a nation changed, one tempered by fire, welded together by loss, and ready, at last, to face whatever came next. The sea had carried them home, but now the sky would decide if they could stay. In the weeks after Dunkirk, as the last fires in France died out and the guns fell silent across the Channel, Britain stood alone against a continent in chains. The soldiers who had escaped the beaches were back on English soil, unarmed but unbroken, and already the next chapter of the war was taking shape. What had been an evacuation would now become a stand, the stand for Britain itself. The army that returned from Dunkirk was battered, weary, and stripped of everything but spirit. Thousands of rifles, vehicles, and artillery pieces had been left behind in the sand. The soldiers who disembarked at Dover carried only their helmets, their uniforms, and a hollow disbelief that they were still alive. Yet there was no time to rest. Within days, they were reassembled into new units, sent to training camps, and ordered to dig defenses along the southern coast. The beaches of Kent, Sussex, and Norfolk became fortresses. Barbed wire and anti-tank obstacles lined the shores. Trenches were dug, pillboxes poured from concrete. Farmers turned fields into airstrips, schoolboys joined the home guard, drilling with broomsticks where rifles should have been. It was a strange army, a patchwork of veterans, recruits, and civilians, but it was all that stood between Britain and Hitler's invasion. The Royal Navy kept watch over the Channel, its ships moving like shadows in the fog, ready to repel any attempt to cross. Yet everyone knew the invasion, if it came, would not start on the sea. It would begin in the air. Across occupied France, the Luftwaffe was already gathering, bombers lined wing to wing along captured airfields, fighters gleaming beneath the summer sun. Germany had conquered Europe in a matter of months. Now Hitler believed he could break Britain in a matter of weeks. He called it Operation Sea Lion, the invasion that would begin only after the Royal Air Force had been destroyed. But the RAF was ready. Its pilots were young, many barely 20, and its numbers were few. They called themselves the Few, though they didn't yet know that Churchill would later make the name immortal. They came from across the empire, Canadians, Poles, New Zealanders, Czechs, and Englishmen all standing shoulder to shoulder in the cockpits of Spitfires and Hurricanes. Their task was simple and impossible: defend the skies over Britain at any cost. Airfields were prepared, radar stations activated, squadrons scrambled day and night. The men slept in their flight suits, ready to launch at a moment's notice. In briefing rooms, maps of southern England were covered in red pins marking incoming raids. Mechanics worked through the night, hands black with oil, patching bullet holes and refueling planes that would be back in the air by dawn. Meanwhile, the mood in Britain shifted. Dunkirk had been deliverance, but Churchill refused to let the nation grow complacent. On June 4, 1940, just 2 days after the last men were rescued, he addressed the House of Commons. His words were grave, deliberate, meant not to comfort, but to steel the people for what was coming. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. Those words cut through the relief like a knife. He reminded the nation that the fight had only just begun, that Dunkirk had saved lives but not victory. "The Battle of France is over," he said. "I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." In those sentences, he laid out the future. Britain would not surrender. It would stand alone if it had to, in the fields, on the seas, and now, in the skies. Factories in Birmingham, Coventry, and Glasgow roared to life, producing aircraft faster than ever before. Women took the place of men in the assembly lines, riveting wings, wiring engines, and painting insignia beneath the roar of engines. Every completed Spitfire was a promise, a blade forged for the coming storm. The soldiers, too, prepared in silence. They watched the sky as they dug their trenches, listening to the hum of engines overhead. Many had fought in France, they knew what it meant when the bombs came. But this time, they would not be retreating to the sea. This time, there was nowhere left to go. At night, Britain's cities were cloaked in blackout. Windows were covered, lights dimmed, and people moved through the streets in near darkness. The silence was deceptive, it felt like calm, but it was only the pause before the storm. The country held its breath, waiting for the first bomb to fall. In Germany, Hitler grew impatient. He could not understand why the British refused to make peace. To him, Dunkirk should have been the end, proof that Britain was beaten. But Churchill had turned that disaster into a declaration. The evacuation that should have broken the nation had instead bound it together. From the ashes of Dunkirk came a new kind of resolve, not pride in victory, but pride in survival. The British people had learned that they could endure the unimaginable. And now, they would need that lesson again. As the summer of 1940 began, the sky itself became the new battlefield. The fate of Britain, and, in time, the fate of the free world, would hang not on ships or soldiers, but on the wings of young men soaring through the clouds, fighting for a nation that refused to die. Dunkirk had been the prelude, the moment the tide turned, not in triumph, but in will. What came next would decide everything. The men who had escaped the fire would now defend their homeland from it. The miracle of the sea would give way to the Battle of Britain, where the same spirit, the spirit of Dunkirk, would rise again, this time into the sky. By the dawn of June 4, 1940, the beaches of Dunkirk were quiet for the first time in days, not peaceful, but hollow. Smoke still hung over the sea like a funeral shroud, the air thick with the smell of salt, oil, and ash. The thunder of guns had faded into distant echoes. The evacuation, Operation Dynamo, was over. What remained was ruin. The final ships had left under fire through the night. German artillery pounded the harbor until the last moment, shells landing with heavy, rhythmic crashes. The Royal Navy destroyers Shikari, Sabre, and Kelvin made the final runs, ferrying the last exhausted groups of men off the beach while searchlights from the dunes traced their outlines in the dark. Each wave of departing boats carried fewer and fewer soldiers, the rest had already been taken prisoner or were too wounded to move. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, deep beneath Dover Castle, received the last signal in the early hours of the morning. It was brief and emotionless, operation complete. When the numbers were tallied, they seemed almost impossible. 338,226 soldiers had been rescued from the jaws of destruction. It had begun as an act of desperation, an evacuation expected to save perhaps 30,000 men at most. The first ships had left Dover believing they would only have time to rescue a fraction before the Germans closed in. Instead, against all odds, they had brought home nearly an entire army. The beaches that had once been filled with chaos were now littered with the remains of salvation, helmets, rifles, wrecked vehicles, and the twisted carcasses of ships half buried in the surf. But the cost had been immense. Over 200 Royal Navy ships and civilian vessels lay at the bottom of the channel, destroyers torn apart by bombs, fishing boats sunk by machine gun fire, minesweepers gone missing in the night. at least 68,000 Allied soldiers were killed, captured, or never found. The sea itself became their grave, the waves carrying fragments of uniforms, letters, and shattered wood back to shore for weeks afterward. Those who survived the last night of evacuation spoke of a haunting calm, of the glow of burning oil tanks lighting the horizon, of the silence between bombardments, and of the strange realization that they had lived when so many others had not. A Royal Navy sailor who helped on the final voyage later wrote, "It was like leaving ghosts behind. The beach didn't look like a battlefield anymore. It looked like the end of the world." When the Germans entered Dunkirk later that morning, they found a wasteland. Burnt-out tanks, overturned trucks, and charred corpses were strewn across the sand. The wooden mole, where thousands had once queued for rescue, jutted brokenly into the sea. The once proud port city was unrecognizable, every street flattened, every building scarred. For those who had escaped, the emotional weight of the operation would take time to settle. The men were hailed as heroes, but many felt only numbness. Some wept quietly aboard the trains that carried them inland, others simply stared out the windows, unable to speak. The ship's decks were slick with seawater and tears. They had come through hell, but they could not yet call it deliverance. Back in Dover, as the final reports arrived, Admiral Ramsay removed his cap and stared at the figures in silence. His staff waited for him to speak. Finally, he murmured, "We have done the impossible, and we shall never see its like again." In London, Churchill prepared his speech to Parliament. The evacuation had been completed just hours before, and the nation waited to hear what would come next. His words would be immortal. "We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender." He knew the truth that others did not, that Dunkirk had not been a victory, but a reprieve. The army had been saved, but Britain was now nearly defenseless. The war was far from over. Still, the scale of what had been achieved could not be denied. Over 338,000 souls, British, French, and Belgian, had crossed the Channel under fire. Each man carried the memory of what he had seen, comrades drowned beside him, planes falling into the sea, ships vanishing in flames. Each carried, too, the knowledge that they had been part of something larger, an act of endurance, of defiance, of survival. As the sun rose over the Channel, the tide washed over the beaches of Dunkirk, covering the wreckage in a thin layer of sand. The fires still burned, but the sounds of battle were gone. The seagulls returned, circling above the empty shore. The war had moved on, leaving behind only smoke and silence. The soldiers called it deliverance. Historians would call it miracle. But for those who had stood on the sand, waiting for rescue as the world collapsed around them, it would always be something simpler and heavier, the moment when survival became the only victory that mattered. Operation Dynamo had ended. But the spirit it had forged, the will to fight, to endure, to hope even in the shadow of defeat, had only just begun. Across England, the news spread like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. At first, no one dared believe it. For days, families had been living in dread, staring across the Channel toward a France that seemed to be collapsing into darkness. The British Expeditionary Force, sons, fathers, brothers, had been trapped, cut off, doomed. And then, suddenly, the radio crackled with words that no one expected to hear: "They are coming home." From that moment, the island seemed to breathe again. In pubs, churches, and factories, people gathered around radios and newspapers, trying to make sense of the impossible, hundreds of thousands of men rescued from the jaws of defeat. The BBC's evening broadcast carried the first official statement: "The operation continues under heavy fire. Many thousands have already been brought to safety." The cautious tone did little to hide the wonder in the announcer's voice. By the next morning, the full scope of the miracle began to take shape. Headlines in black, bold print screamed across the front pages, "Miracle of Deliverance. Our boys home from Dunkirk. A nation saved by courage." People poured into the streets, waving flags, cheering the return of men they had feared lost forever. Train stations overflowed as survivors arrived from the southern ports, still wrapped in army blankets and smelling of salt and smoke. Women brought them tea and sandwiches, children followed them, wide-eyed, as though watching ghosts come back to life. But the joy was not blind. Beneath the relief was the quiet knowledge of what had been lost, the friends who had not made it, the ships that would never return. Yet even sorrow seemed smaller in the face of gratitude. "They are home," people said again and again. That's what matters. For the first time in the war, Britain felt united, not by victory, but by endurance. The Dunkirk spirit was born in those days, the idea that courage, cooperation, and sheer stubborn will could overcome anything. It wasn't triumphalism, it was something deeper, humbler. The belief that survival itself could be a kind of victory. In churches across the country, special services were held to give thanks. Bells that had been silent since the outbreak of war rang again, their chimes echoing through towns and villages. In London, crowds filled Westminster Abbey for a national day of prayer. The air still smelled of rationed tobacco and rain as people knelt in pews, whispering words of gratitude. The little ships, the civilian vessels that had crossed the channel, became symbols of that spirit. Fishing boats, ferries, lifeboats, even pleasure yachts had sailed into hell to save men they had never met. Many never came back. The ones that did were met with awe. Newspapers printed their names as if they were war heroes. The Sundowner, the Tamzine, the Medway Queen, the Mona's Isle, their stories spread like legend. In seaside towns, the owners of those boats were celebrated by neighbors who had watched them leave and counted the hours until they returned. Some came back scarred by shrapnel, their hulls blackened with smoke. Others drifted home under tow, empty but triumphant. To the people of Britain, they represented something profound, the courage of ordinary men and women who refused to stand aside. On the radio, Churchill's voice filled the nation. His speech to Parliament was replayed across the airwaves, its gravity softened by quiet pride. "We shall fight on the beaches," he declared, his words rolling like thunder through every living room. When he reached the final line, "We shall never surrender," even those who had lost everything felt something stir inside them. Factories redoubled their efforts. Women in overalls and headscarves worked through the night, building planes, tanks, and rifles to replace what had been left behind in France. The posters went up again, "Keep calm and carry on. We can take it." But this time, they meant something. The people believed them. Letters poured into newspapers and local councils from civilians offering help, farmers pledging tractors for defense, volunteers signing up for the Home Guard, fishermen writing, "If you need us again, we'll go." The sense of isolation that had shadowed Britain since the fall of France gave way to something else, a collective defiance, a quiet roar that spread from village to village, city to city. For the soldiers who returned, the reaction was overwhelming. Many could not comprehend the hero's welcome. They saw only the ghosts of those still stranded or buried in the sand. But as they stepped off the trains and heard the cheers, some began to understand. They had not brought victory, but they had brought hope. The phrase Dunkirk spirit soon appeared in speeches, editorials, and everyday conversation. It meant perseverance in the face of disaster, courage without glory, unity in the face of fear. It became the moral backbone of Britain's coming struggle, a reminder that the nation, though battered, still had a heartbeat. Across the Channel, the beaches of Dunkirk lay silent, strewn with wreckage and the dead. But across Britain, the echoes of that place carried in every bell that rang, every flag that waved, every voice that promised to carry on. For a moment, amid the fire and uncertainty, Britain stood taller. Dunkirk had not been a victory, but it had shown what victory might one day look like, not conquest, but survival, not pride, but unity. And that spirit, born in fear and forged in courage, would carry the nation through the darkest days still to come. The House of Commons was silent when Churchill rose to speak. It was June 4, 1940, the very day the last ships left Dunkirk. The air in the chamber was thick with smoke and fatigue. The faces of the ministers told the story of a country that had come within a breath of catastrophe. France was falling, Europe was lost, and the British Army, the heart of the nation's defense, had barely escaped annihilation. The weight of defeat hung over everyone. And then came his voice. It was gravel and steel, the voice of a man who had not slept in days, whose cigar trembled slightly in his fingers as he spoke, not as a politician, but as a man standing before the edge of the abyss. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. The words cut through the chamber like cold air. He did not flatter them with illusions. There was no talk of glory or triumph, only the hard truth. But behind that truth, there was something else, defiance. The same unyielding spirit that had carried men through the fire and smoke of Dunkirk now stood at the heart of his speech. He spoke of the ordeal that had just passed, of the navy and the little ships, of the soldiers who had crossed the sea under fire. He called it a miracle of deliverance, but made sure no one mistook it for victory. The army had been saved, but Britain was now facing its darkest hour. Hitler's forces controlled the continent, and the Channel was all that stood between them and invasion. "The Battle of France is over," he said. "I expect that the Battle of Britain is about to begin." The words were both a warning and a promise. As he continued, his tone shifted, from sorrow to strength, from realism to something almost transcendent. His voice, rough and deliberate, filled the chamber until even his political enemies leaned forward, caught in the rhythm of his conviction. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." The repetition was deliberate. It was not rhetoric, it was ritual, a chant for a nation on the edge. Each phrase was a drumbeat, pounding against despair. He wasn't just speaking to Parliament. He was speaking to every factory worker, every mother in blackout darkness, every soldier standing watch on the coast. Outside those walls, the speech echoed across radios and newspapers, carried by the BBC to the entire nation. People stopped what they were doing to listen. In kitchens and air raid shelters, in pubs and on factory floors, they leaned closer to the static, hearing the same unshakable message: "We will not yield." Churchill understood something fundamental about war, that before battles are fought with weapons, they are fought with belief. His words were not simply reassurance, they were psychological warfare, aimed as much at the British people as at Hitler himself. To the people, the speech was a lifeline. It gave shape to their fear and turned it into purpose. It told them that defeat was not destiny, that even if Britain were invaded, even if the cities burned, they would not bow. To Hitler, the message was unmistakable: this island would not fall quietly. Behind closed doors, some of Churchill's ministers had doubted him. They had whispered of negotiations, of finding a way out before it was too late. But as his speech rang through the Commons that day, even those voices were silenced. By the time he sat down, the chamber erupted in thunderous applause, not of celebration, but of resolve. The government, the army, the people, all were united in a single will: to fight on. That evening, as the sun sank over London, his words began to appear in print. The morning papers would carry them across the country. Even those who had lost sons at Dunkirk found strength in them. A mother in Liverpool wrote in her diary, "He does not promise us peace. He promises that we will endure." For Churchill, it had always been about endurance. He knew Britain could not yet win, not in 1940, not against the full force of the Reich. But he also knew that survival itself could be victory. If Britain could stand, if it could hold out long enough, others would come, America, the dominions, the free nations of the world. His speech was not only for that moment, but for history itself, a declaration that tyranny would not go unchallenged, that freedom would not go quietly into the sea. Years later, those who heard him remembered not the details, but the feeling, that strange, rising certainty that the darkness could be beaten. When Churchill left the Commons that day, he looked weary, almost broken. "They were very brave," he said softly to an aide. "They did not give in. Neither shall we." And so the words carried across the Channel, through the smoke and the wreckage of Dunkirk, across every field and street and shore where men and women waited for the storm to come. Words had become weapons, and in Churchill's voice, Britain had found its shield. When the last men left Dunkirk, the beaches were left behind not as sand, but as graveyards of steel. Across the tide-marked shoreline, wreckage stretched for miles, twisted trucks half buried in the surf, artillery guns scorched black, rifles stacked in heaps beside craters. The air stank of oil and cordite, and the water shimmered with fuel that caught fire with every falling bomb. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped with their lives, but not their war. What remained on those beaches was the physical weight of an empire's army, abandoned in the name of survival. In the chaos of retreat, there had been no time for precision or ceremony. Orders were given simply: destroy what you cannot take. Crews drained oil from tanks and smashed their engines with sledgehammers. Mechanics poured sand into truck pistons, spiked the breech blocks of artillery, and set fire to their own fuel depots. Whole convoys of vehicles were driven straight into the surf to prevent their capture. When the last ship departed, the sea itself was filled with burning machines, the bones of a modern army left to sink beneath the tide. The scale of the loss was staggering. 68,000 vehicles, 2,400 guns, and 500,000 tons of ammunition and fuel were gone. Thousands of tons of food, clothing, and medical supplies, all abandoned. Even personal equipment was left behind: helmets, maps, letters, and rifles lay strewn across the dunes. What had once been an army was now, as one general put it, a body without a skeleton. Photographs later showed the haunting sight: rows of trucks and Bren carriers melting in the heat of their own flames, field guns pointed uselessly toward the sea, soldiers' packs scattered in the sand like fallen leaves. For every man rescued, a machine was lost. And for every gun left behind, Britain's vulnerability grew. When the soldiers returned home, many were still wearing torn uniforms and makeshift bandages. They had no weapons, no vehicles, and barely any boots. "We came back naked," one infantryman said. It was not an exaggeration. The British Army, stripped of its gear, now faced the impossible task of rebuilding an arsenal in weeks that had taken years to create. Churchill knew the urgency. "An army without weapons is not an army," he told Parliament. "It is a target." Factories across Britain were immediately put on a war footing. Civilian industries were converted overnight, car plants began producing armored vehicles, typewriter manufacturers built rifles, and furniture makers turned to crafting aircraft wings. Production schedules that once measured time in months were now measured in days. The spirit of Dunkirk carried into the factories. Men and women worked double shifts, often sleeping on site between hours. Posters went up in workshops: "Remember Dunkirk, every bullet counts." Engineers designed simpler weapons that could be built faster, while the government imposed rationing to redirect every ounce of metal and fuel toward the war effort. Still, Britain could not stand alone. The nation's stockpiles were gone, its treasury strained, its factories overwhelmed. It was then that the first lifeline from across the Atlantic began to take shape. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, watching events unfold, pushed for American aid despite the isolationist mood in Congress. His program, what would soon be known as Lend-Lease, promised ships, aircraft, and raw materials to Britain in the defense of democracy. Even before it became official, American industry began to move. Merchant convoys crossed the Atlantic carrying food, trucks, and machinery. In ports from Liverpool to Glasgow, crates marked "Made in the USA" began to appear. They contained rifles, engines, and spare parts, the bones of the new army that would rise from Dunkirk's ashes. In Birmingham and Coventry, blacksmiths and machinists worked under the threat of air raids, forging tank plates and aircraft components by candlelight when the power went out. Every hammer strike was an act of defiance, every shipment a small victory. By the autumn of 1940, Britain was beginning to rearm. The losses of Dunkirk had been catastrophic, but they had also unleashed a kind of creative fury, a national realization that survival depended not only on courage, but on the power to rebuild faster than the enemy could destroy. The old army had been built for defense. The new one would be built for vengeance. Years later, soldiers returning to the beaches of Dunkirk would find traces of what they had left behind, rusted helmets half buried in the sand, tank hulls sinking deeper with every tide. The metal was silent, but it told the story of sacrifice made for salvation. Those broken machines had bought time for the army to rise again, for Britain to find its strength, and for the free world to arm itself for the long war ahead. Dunkirk had taken everything material from Britain, but in losing everything, it had forced the nation to discover the one resource the enemy could not capture, the will to rebuild, no matter the cost. In the weeks after Dunkirk, as Britain celebrated the miracle of deliverance, France was dying. What had begun as a retreat became a collapse. What had once been a proud republic was now unraveling under the boots of the German army. The beaches of Dunkirk had been the Allies' last stand together. After that, France would face its fate alone. The German advance was unstoppable. Hitler's armies, flushed with victory, rolled across northern France in columns that seemed endless. The roads were choked with the debris of war, broken vehicles, abandoned guns, and the bodies of soldiers who had never reached the coast. Above them, the Luftwaffe patrolled the skies like vultures, strafing fleeing convoys of troops and civilians alike. Every bridge, every crossroads, every farmhouse became a battlefield. By early June, the French army was shattered. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. Ammunition was scarce, communication lines had collapsed. The front had dissolved into chaos. To the north, Dunkirk was in ruins, its beaches blackened and silent. To the south, the German spearheads raced toward Paris. In desperation, the French government abandoned the capital on June 10, 1940. The streets of Paris, once alive with the hum of cafes and trams, fell eerily still. Refugees flooded the roads heading south, carrying what little they could on carts and bicycles. It was the largest migration in modern European history, millions of people fleeing their own country, chased by the echo of gunfire. On June 14, the Germans entered Paris. There was no battle, no last defense. The French command had declared it an open city to spare destruction. German motorcyclists sped through the empty boulevards, their engines echoing off the stone facades. By afternoon, the swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. The radio in Berlin announced the conquest of France with triumphal fanfare. In London, Churchill received the news in silence. France, Britain's greatest ally, had fallen in 6 weeks. The French government, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, the aging hero of Verdun, sought an end to the carnage. The "The fighting must stop," he told the nation in a trembling voice. "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you we must cease hostilities." On June 22, in the very same railway carriage at Compiègne where Germany had once surrendered in 1918, the French delegation signed the armistice with Hitler. The humiliation was deliberate. France was divided in two, the North and West under direct German occupation, the South under a new, collaborationist regime, Vichy France. For many French soldiers and civilians, the signing was a betrayal that cut deeper than defeat. They had fought to the last, holding the line around Dunkirk and beyond, only to see their leaders surrender. The bitterness was compounded by the evacuation. To them, Dunkirk had been both a miracle and a wound. Britain had saved its army but abandoned France to its fate. "They have taken their sons home," one French officer said, "and left ours to die." In Britain, Churchill understood the resentment but had no choice. "Had we stayed," he later said, "we should have been destroyed with them." It was a truth that could not heal the wound. The alliance between Britain and France, forged in centuries of blood and struggle, was broken. But even in the ruins of defeat, not all of France submitted. In London, a young general named Charles de Gaulle, who had refused to accept the armistice, made a broadcast on the BBC on June 18, a voice in exile calling to a conquered nation. "France has lost a battle," he declared, "but France has not lost the war." Those words, heard by only a few at the time, would become the foundation of the French resistance. In occupied France, small groups of men and women began to whisper, organize, and fight back. They distributed leaflets, sabotaged rail lines, and smuggled messages to the Allies. The seeds of rebellion were sown in the ashes of surrender. Meanwhile, in Vichy, Pétain promised honor and renewal, but his government quickly became a puppet of German power. French police arrested Jews and political dissidents. Propaganda denounced de Gaulle and the British as traitors. The tricolor flag still flew, but its meaning had changed. France was no longer free. The British press, while careful not to gloat, recognized the gravity of the moment. Dunkirk had saved an army, but it had not saved Europe. Now Britain stood alone, facing the Reich across the narrow strip of sea that had become its last defense. Churchill, speaking to his cabinet, put it plainly, "The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin." And yet, across the Channel, amid the occupation and despair, echoes of that same spirit that had driven the men at Dunkirk began to stir in France. Resistance networks spread quietly through the countryside. The people who refused to kneel to tyranny began to dream of liberation and of vengeance. For the French, Dunkirk would always be remembered with mixed emotions: pride in their courage, sorrow for their loss, anger for their abandonment. But out of that tragedy, a new France would rise, one that fought from the shadows until it could fight in the light again. In 1944, when Allied troops returned to France, many of the soldiers who landed on the beaches of Normandy carried with them memories of Dunkirk, of the retreat, the loss, and the vow never to leave their allies behind again. The fall of France had been the darkest hour. But even in defeat, the fire of resistance had been lit, a flame that would one day burn bright enough to guide the world back toward freedom. They were never in the headlines. They had no medals waiting for them, no speeches written in their honor. But without them, Operation Dynamo would have failed before it began. They were the silent gears of the miracle, the men and women who worked in darkness, under fire, or without sleep, to make the impossible happen. In the underground tunnels beneath Dover Castle, Admiral Bertram Ramsay directed the evacuation like a conductor guiding an orchestra of chaos. But surrounding him were hundreds of others, signalers hunched over crackling radios, clerks transcribing messages by candlelight, runners sprinting through the narrow corridors with urgent orders. They worked amid exhaustion and fear, their world reduced to maps, wires, and the endless hum of Morse code. Each transmission they sent might mean life or death for a ship full of soldiers. Above ground, the cliffs shook with the distant thunder of artillery. The staff could feel it through the floor, a low vibration that never stopped. Yet they continued, eyes red, hands trembling, copying coordinates that would direct ships through smoke and darkness. Some of them were only teenagers, recruited straight from civilian jobs to operate naval communications. They never saw Dunkirk with their own eyes, but their voices, transmitted through static, were the thread that held the operation together. On the beaches, others fought their own battles. Royal engineers built makeshift piers from wreckage, hammering together sections of wood and steel under constant air raids. One of them later recalled, "We weren't soldiers anymore, we were builders, trying to hold back the sea and the war at the same time." They repaired the fragile wooden mole again and again, even as bombs tore it apart. Every hour they bought meant thousands more men could be rescued. At the docks of Dover, Ramsgate, and Margate, civilian dockworkers and sailors labored without rest. They hauled ropes, loaded wounded men, refueled ships that came in blazing from the channel. Many had never served in the military, but that distinction no longer mattered. A mechanic named George Hales stayed on the pier for 4 days straight, repairing ship engines by lamplight. "I just kept turning wrenches," he said later. If the engines stopped, so did the rescue. In the harbors and hospitals of southern England, the quiet army of women carried their share of the miracle. Nurses, volunteers, and telegraph operators worked through sleepless nights as the ships arrived, bringing in men who could barely walk. The hospital wards filled beyond capacity, so they turned town halls, schools, and even churches into makeshift infirmaries. The nurses washed oil and blood from the faces of strangers, changed bandages by candlelight, and whispered to men who cried out for mothers, wives, or brothers lost on the beaches. In Dover, Nurse Margaret Booth wrote in her diary, "They come in silent. Some shake, some laugh, some just stare. I hold their hands and pretend I'm not afraid." At Ramsgate, members of the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens, coordinated fleet movements from crowded operations rooms. They plotted ship positions on giant wall maps using long wooden rods, their fingers stained with chalk and graphite. Every movement they marked meant another convoy guided safely home through the mine-strewn channel. But the greatest of the hidden heroes were the civilians who went out to sea. The fishermen, ferrymen, and yacht owners who volunteered their boats to the Navy, the heart of the little ships. Many never returned. A small pleasure craft named the Renown was sunk with all hands on her second voyage. The MFV-26, a fishing trawler, was strafed and set ablaze while pulling men from the water. None of their names made it into the newspapers, their deaths were folded into the statistics of war. Yet their sacrifice was no less noble than that of any soldier. One crewman from a Thames barge remembered passing through the burning waters near Dunkirk. "We could see men waving from the shore. We just kept going back. You didn't think about dying. You just thought, there's another one to save." There were also those who never left Britain but gave everything they had. In small coastal towns, families opened their homes to the returning soldiers, feeding and clothing them despite rationing. In one village near Deal, a baker named Alice Hardy worked day and night, baking loaves for the troops being brought ashore. When asked why she didn't rest, she simply said, "They've done their bit. This is mine." By the time Operation Dynamo ended, hundreds of these invisible heroes were dead, killed in air raids, drowned at sea, or lost to exhaustion and illness. Their names rarely appeared in the records, but their fingerprints were on every rescued life. Churchill knew it, even if few others did. In a private note after the evacuation, he wrote, "There were those whose faces we will never know, who kept the lamps burning in the storm. Without them, there would have been no miracle." The story of Dunkirk is often told in the roar of aircraft and the thunder of the guns, but it was sustained by whispers, by the soft murmur of code signals, by the steady hands of nurses, by the anonymous courage of those who worked unseen. They did not fight for medals or glory. They fought with wrenches, with telegraphs, with bandages, with faith. And when the history books spoke of a miracle, it was their unseen labor, their quiet courage in the shadows, that gave the miracle its soul. History often turns not on the battles fought, but on the moments when nothing happens, when hesitation, pride, or a single misguided decision alters the course of fate. In the story of Dunkirk, that moment came with Hitler's halt order, a command so unexpected, so disastrous in hindsight, that historians still debate whether it was an act of mercy, madness, or miscalculation. It was, quite simply, the day Germany's victories slipped through its own fingers. By May 24, 1940, the German army had achieved the unthinkable. In just 2 weeks, its armored divisions had smashed through the Ardennes, bypassed the Maginot Line, and driven deep into France. The British Expeditionary Force and much of the French army were trapped along the northern coast. The German panzers, led by Generals Heinz Guderian, Ewald von Kleist, and Erwin Rommel, had reached within sight of Dunkirk. The Allied army was surrounded, pressed against the sea, with nowhere left to run. The German commanders could smell victory. The Wehrmacht had momentum, superiority, and complete control of the battlefield. Guderian's tanks had raced ahead faster than anyone thought possible, cutting through Allied defenses like a blade through glass. A few more days of attack, they believed, and the pocket at Dunkirk would be crushed. The British Army, the heart of the Allied war effort, would be annihilated. Then, without warning, the order came down: all armored units are to halt. The panzers stopped in their tracks. Engines idled, guns cooled, and the dust of the advance settled into silence. The order had come directly from Adolf Hitler, endorsed by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of Army Group A. For 48 crucial hours, the German armor, the very force that had driven the Allied armies to the brink of destruction, did nothing. In Berlin, the decision seemed logical to some. Hitler believed the ground near Dunkirk was too marshy for tanks. Rundstedt, cautious by nature, feared that his fast-moving panzer divisions had outpaced their supply lines and risked counterattack. The Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring, assured Hitler that his bombers could finish the job. "Leave them to me," Göring boasted. "My eagles will destroy them on the beaches." But to the men in the field, the ones who had fought, bled, and driven across France, the order was insanity. General Guderian was furious. His armored columns had the British cornered, and now he was being told to stop. "We were at the very gates of victory," he later wrote. "The enemy was helpless, and we were forced to sit and watch him escape." Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, felt the same. His tanks were so close to Dunkirk that he could see the smoke rising from the harbor. He wanted to strike immediately. Instead, the panzers stood idle, while the Luftwaffe launched its attacks. But the air raids, though devastating, could not stop the evacuation. The RAF fought back ferociously, and the weather, cloudy skies and fog, shielded the beaches. The bombers killed thousands, yet still the ships came. Still the soldiers escaped. By the time Hitler lifted the halt order on May 26, it was too late. The British had used the precious 2-day pause to fortify the Dunkirk perimeter and organize Operation Dynamo. Destroyers, fishing boats, and ferries were already crossing the channel. Every hour of German delay meant thousands more Allied soldiers reaching safety. The decision baffled Hitler's own staff. Some believed it was political rather than military, that Hitler, seeing the fall of France as inevitable, wanted to avoid humiliating the British too completely. Perhaps he still hoped that Britain would seek peace and leave Germany free to turn against the Soviet Union. Others suggested that Göring's arrogance, his belief that air power alone could destroy the trapped army, had clouded Hitler's judgment. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. When the panzers finally resumed their advance, they met stiff resistance. The French rearguard and British defenders fought with desperate ferocity. By the time German armor reached Dunkirk, the beaches were nearly empty. The bulk of the British expeditionary force, more than 330,000 men, was gone. The German generals knew what had been lost. "The Führer has made a great mistake," General Franz Halder, the army chief of staff, wrote in his diary. Others were less diplomatic. Guderian called it one of the most significant decisions of the war, and one that cost Germany ultimate victory. In his headquarters, Hitler dismissed their complaints. He was convinced that his halt had been a stroke of prudence, that he had saved his tanks for the greater conquest of France. And indeed, within weeks, France fell. But in that brief window between May 24 and May 26, the war's course had changed forever. Because of that pause, that single moment of hesitation, Britain survived. The army that escaped from Dunkirk would later defend the island in the Battle of Britain, and years later, return to Europe on D-Day. The soldiers who had stood helpless on the beaches in 1940 would one day march back through France, driving the Germans before them. Historians would come to call it Germany's missed victory, the lost chance to destroy the Allies once and for all. Some say it was hubris, others, divine providence. But in the end, the cause mattered less than the consequence. For 48 hours, the German war machine paused. And in that pause, the tide of history shifted. The smoke over Dunkirk cleared, the ships sailed, and the soldiers lived, because the man who ruled half of Europe had chosen, for reasons still debated, to stop. When the first reports of Dunkirk reached the world, they carried the contradictory weight of both disaster and deliverance. The beaches of northern France had become a symbol of defeat for some, of endurance for others. Across the oceans and continents, nations watched as Britain stood on the knife's edge, unsure whether the miracle of Dunkirk marked the beginning of survival or the final chapter of resistance. In the United States, the news arrived in fragments, radio bulletins describing thousands of British soldiers stranded on foreign shores, ships crossing the channel under fire, and an evacuation that defied reason. The American public, still divided by deep isolationist sentiment, listened in stunned fascination. Newspapers ran bold headlines, "British Army saved from extinction, miracle at SEA," and for the first time since the war began, the struggle in Europe began to feel personal. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, cautious but perceptive, followed every report with growing concern. He understood the stakes. If Britain fell, the world would stand alone against Hitler's new order. Privately, he admired Churchill's resolve and saw in Dunkirk not a defeat, but a sign of the unbreakable British spirit. In a quiet conversation with his advisors, Roosevelt remarked, "A people who can turn retreat into legend will not go down easily." Yet in public, he was measured. The Neutrality Acts still bound the United States to non-involvement. America was not ready for war. Roosevelt had to walk a political tightrope, expressing sympathy without committing to intervention. Still, he found subtle ways to act. The administration began quietly expanding naval patrols, accelerating arms production, and exploring the possibility of lending aid to Britain. The seeds of Lend-Lease, which would later arm the Allies, were sown in the shadow of Dunkirk. American journalists sent vivid dispatches from London, describing both the destruction and the defiance. One correspondent for the New York Times wrote, "They came home wet, cold, and unarmed, yet the look in their eyes was not of defeat, but of survival. They are the army that will fight again." That line struck a chord. In towns and cities across America, church services were held for the British soldiers. Some Americans began to see the war not as Europe's conflict, but as civilization's. The image of small civilian boats crossing the sea, ordinary men rescuing an army, stirred imaginations across the Atlantic. It reminded many Americans of their own revolutionary struggle, of ordinary citizens rising in defense of freedom. In Berlin, the reaction was very different. Nazi propaganda went into overdrive. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda declared Dunkirk a British catastrophe, portraying it as proof of German superiority. The Völkischer Beobachter printed headlines proclaiming the shameful flight of the British Army. Newsreels showed captured vehicles, wrecked ships, and soldiers trudging through the surf, claiming that Hitler had graciously spared the British from total annihilation. Privately, however, not all German leaders were celebrating. The Wehrmacht's high command knew how close they had come to destroying the British Expeditionary Force entirely. Many officers grumbled that what should have been the final blow of the war had turned into a lost opportunity. Hitler's decision to halt the panzers, which had seemed prudent at the time, was now being quietly questioned. In the German press, these doubts were hidden, replaced with triumphal boasts. To the rest of the world, the truth lay somewhere between the propaganda and the miracle. Dunkirk was indeed a retreat, but it was also a testament to the endurance of democracy under siege. In neutral nations, people followed the story with a mix of awe and apprehension. In Spain and Sweden, editorials called Dunkirk a tragedy redeemed by courage. In Switzerland, newspapers praised the civilians who had risked everything to save strangers across the Channel. Even in occupied Europe, where Nazi censorship was spreading, whispers of Dunkirk became a quiet symbol of hope. Underground networks in France and the Netherlands spread the story of the little ships, the fishing boats, ferries, and yachts that had crossed into the inferno and returned. If the English can endure, one French teacher wrote in a secret letter, then so can we. In the British Commonwealth, the news galvanized nations separated by oceans. In Canada, enlistment surged. In Australia and New Zealand, speeches invoked Dunkirk as a warning and a call to unity. The message was simple: if Britain fell, the war would reach every shore. Across the empire, radio crackled with the voice of Winston Churchill, whose words after Dunkirk reached even the farthest colonies. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender." Those words became more than a speech, they became a promise. Dunkirk's power lay not just in its survival, but in how it was seen. To the Allies, it became a story of courage in the face of annihilation. To the Axis, it was a victory that somehow tasted like failure. And to the neutral world, watching the flames of Europe spread, it was proof that even in retreat, freedom could endure. As one American journalist would later write, at Dunkirk, the British Army escaped, but something greater emerged from those waters, the belief that they could, and must, fight on. The world had watched a nation cornered, and seen it refuse to die. Above the beaches of Dunkirk, while tens of thousands of soldiers waited helplessly in the sand, another battle raged, invisible to most of those below. The men on the beaches often looked up and cursed, swearing that the Royal Air Force had abandoned them. They could see German bombers overhead, hear the scream of falling bombs, and feel the shockwaves that shook the ground. What they couldn't see were the dogfights, fierce, desperate, and often fatal, being fought miles inland and high above the Channel, where the RAF was dying to keep the Luftwaffe away. For every German plane that reached Dunkirk, many more were intercepted before they could. The RAF's contribution was not absent, it was unseen. The Royal Air Force, under the command of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, understood that the skies over the Channel were the key to the evacuation's success. Dowding's order was clear: protect the beaches. Protect the ships. Hold the line in the air. It was a near impossible mission. the Luftwaffe outnumbered the RAF almost 3-1, and the German airfields in France and Belgium were only minutes away from the battle zone. British pilots had to cross the channel each time they engaged, leaving little room for error or fuel. Yet they flew again and again. From May 26 to June 4, 1940, the RAF carried out over 3,500 sorties. The fighter pilots of No. 11 Group, flying Spitfires and Hurricanes, engaged German bombers and escorts relentlessly. They took off from airfields in southern England, often 4 or 5 times a day, flying until exhaustion blurred their vision. The dogfights were chaotic, violent dances of death across the skies, brief flashes of silver in the sunlight, bursts of tracer fire, and plumes of smoke spiraling into the sea. Among the pilots were not only Britons, but volunteers from across the world: Polish, Czech, Canadian, New Zealander, and South African aviators who had come to fight long before their nations were officially at war. Many had already lost their homelands to the Germans. For them, the skies over Dunkirk were not just a battlefield, they were an act of vengeance. One Polish pilot, Flight Lieutenant Władysław GNYS, described it simply: "We were not flying for medals. We were flying for home." The Luftwaffe's mission was clear: to crush the evacuation by destroying ships and men before they could escape. German Stuka dive bombers attacked in screaming dives, their sirens designed to spread terror. Destroyers and trawlers were easy targets, many were hit, some obliterated entirely. Yet each day, fewer German planes reached their targets. The RAF had learned to anticipate the attacks, intercepting bomber formations before they reached the beaches. The cost was terrible. Over 145 British aircraft were lost during the 9 days of the evacuation, along with dozens of pilots, men barely in their 20s. But the Luftwaffe lost nearly twice as many. Each German bomber that fell meant another ship or group of soldiers spared below. The soldiers on the beaches rarely saw the dogfights that decided their fate. The sky over Dunkirk often appeared empty, save for the thunder of engines somewhere beyond the clouds. To them, it seemed like abandonment. Letters written later by survivors often included bitterness. Where was the RAF, they asked. The truth, learned only after the war, was that the RAF had been there all along, above the horizon, beyond their sight, fighting battles that could not be witnessed from the ground. The Royal Air Force's pilots fought without the luxury of glory. There were no cameras, no cheering crowds, only exhaustion and loss. Many landed back in England with bullet holes in their wings and fuel gauges on empty, their hands shaking as they climbed from their cockpits. Ground crews refueled their planes, patched the holes, and sent them straight back into the air. The rhythm became mechanical: land, rearm, fly, fight, survive if lucky. Over the channel, the bodies of fallen airmen drifted with the tide, nameless and unseen. Their deaths bought minutes, then hours, time enough for the little ships to keep crossing, for the men on the beaches to keep boarding. By the end of the evacuation, the RAF had done what few thought possible: it had held the skies long enough for 338,000 soldiers to escape. When Churchill later addressed Parliament, he made sure to correct the misconception. When we look back upon those days, let us not forget that the Royal Air Force, outnumbered, and under continuous attack, made possible the deliverance of the army. Dunkirk was a test not only of endurance but of coordination between land, sea, and air. And it was the RAF's endurance that bridged the impossible. In the months that followed, the lessons of Dunkirk would shape Britain's defense. The pilots who survived the evacuation returned to their squadrons just in time for the next great trial, the Battle of Britain. Many who had fought over Dunkirk would soon defend their homeland itself. One of them, squadron leader Geoffrey Wellham, later wrote, "We saved an army at Dunkirk, and at Dunkirk we learned how to save a nation." For those who lived through it, Dunkirk's beaches would forever be tied to the skies above, one silent, one roaring with engines. Together, they formed the twin halves of a miracle, a deliverance written not just in sand and sea, but in the blue fire of the heavens. The beaches of Dunkirk were never meant for soldiers, and yet by late May 1940, they were filled not just with troops but with the faces of ordinary people, mothers clutching children, farmers leading donkeys, elderly couples dragging carts filled with what little they could carry. They came from villages and towns consumed by the German advance, moving not toward safety, but toward the sea, toward the illusion that somewhere across the channel, there might still be peace. The fall of Belgium and northern France had unleashed one of the greatest human migrations in modern history. As German tanks broke through the Ardennes and swept toward the coast, entire cities emptied overnight. Roads were jammed with refugees, soldiers retreating on foot, civilians in wagons or bicycles, endless columns of fear and fatigue. Some fled with nothing but a loaf of bread, others with the keys to homes they would never see again. When the first British and French units fell back toward Dunkirk, the civilians followed. Word spread through the countryside that ships were waiting, that the British were evacuating from the port. It was not true, at least, not for them. But rumor was hope, and hope was all they had. By the time the British Expeditionary Force began its withdrawal, tens of thousands of refugees were already crowding the streets of Dunkirk. Families slept in doorways, in churches, in bombed-out shops. The city that once thrived on fishing and trade now smelled of smoke and cordite. The skies above were never quiet, every hour brought the drone of Luftwaffe bombers, the wail of sirens, and the thunder of explosions. During one air raid, a woman named Claudine Morel, fleeing from Lille with her 2 children, wrote in her diary, "The ground shakes every few minutes. We lie in the sand and cover our faces. I told the children we are just playing a game, that we are moles hiding in our tunnels." The game went on for days. For the British and French soldiers trying to organize the evacuation, the presence of civilians made everything harder, but their suffering was impossible to ignore. Medics shared rations with starving families. Soldiers gave up places on boats for children. In one instance, a platoon of British engineers found a group of Belgian farmers trying to load their oxen onto a fishing trawler. When the soldiers explained there was no room, the farmers cut the animals loose and climbed aboard, silent, tears streaking through soot on their faces. The harbor of Dunkirk, once the artery of trade between Britain and the continent, became a vision of hell. Refugees poured in from every direction, mixing with retreating soldiers. The quays were littered with the wreckage of carts, bicycles, and burned-out trucks. The sound of distant gunfire never stopped. Every few minutes, the line of incoming aircraft sent people diving for cover. The beach became a place of both hope and horror, the sea before them, the enemy behind. British destroyers and little ships arrived to take soldiers home, but few civilians could board. The priority was the army, the rest were left to fend for themselves. Some managed to escape by fishing boats or merchant vessels. Many did not. One French fisherman, Henri Delacourt, made repeated crossings in his trawler Jeannette, taking soldiers one trip and civilians the next. On his final voyage, his boat was bombed and sank just miles from Dover. His wife would later say, "He told me he couldn't leave them behind. He said, if the sea can carry them, so can I." In the countryside surrounding Dunkirk, the roads became graveyards. Abandoned wagons still smoldered where air raids had struck. Entire families lay beside the ruins of their carts, their few possessions scattered, dolls, photographs, bread hardened to stone. The speed of the German advance had turned flight into slaughter. The French army, desperate to slow the Germans, sometimes blew up bridges with refugees still crossing them. It was not cruelty, it was chaos. There was no longer a front line, only a tide of people trying to outrun the inevitable. When the final ships left Dunkirk on June 4th, the beaches were strewn not just with wreckage of war, but with the remnants of those who had fled there. After the British left, the Germans moved in. The civilians who remained were rounded up and sent back inland, to burn towns, occupied homes, and lives forever changed. For Britain, Dunkirk became a symbol of survival. For France and Belgium, it was something else, a memory of abandonment, of the moment when the war stopped being a distant contest of armies and became a personal catastrophe. The refugee stories rarely made it into official accounts. They were not soldiers or leaders, they were the silent witnesses, the ones who paid for every mile of retreat with hunger, grief, and fear. Their war was not measured in victories or losses, but in the desperate need to keep moving. Years later, when Allied forces returned to France in 1944, veterans of Dunkirk found the same towns they had marched through now rebuilt, but haunted by memory. The survivors of that long flight still remember the sound of planes, the rumble of tanks, and the look in the soldiers' eyes as they passed them on the road, exhausted men who had come to save them, only to save themselves. Dunkirk was a miracle for some, but for thousands of civilians, it was a graveyard of hope. A place where the war showed its truest face, not glory or courage, but the endless cost paid by those who had no choice but to run. In the years that followed, the story of Dunkirk began to change. What had been a desperate retreat, a near annihilation, slowly became something else. Newspapers, speeches, and films turned the smoke and chaos of that week into legend. What was once terror in the sand became the miracle of Dunkirk. What had been survival was retold as triumph. When the last ships had returned and the beaches fell silent, Britain did not see defeat, it chose to see deliverance. Winston Churchill, though ever honest in his realism, had already sensed the power of the story. Standing before Parliament, he told the nation, "Wars are not won by evacuations. But this deliverance, this miracle of deliverance, we must remember." And Britain did remember. The legend began almost immediately. The newspapers called it the greatest rescue in history. The BBC broadcast the first-hand accounts of sailors and soldiers, their voices trembling with fatigue and disbelief. Civilians who had lent their boats were paraded through their towns as heroes. Churches filled with prayer, bells rang out not for victory, but for gratitude. Dunkirk became not the end of something, but a beginning, proof that even in catastrophe, courage could prevail. Yet the reality had been far darker. Soldiers had died by the thousands. The RAF had fought invisible battles that few had seen. The beaches had been littered with wreckage, corpses, and despair. But those truths blurred as the legend grew. What people needed was not a record of defeat, they needed meaning. And meaning, Britain found in abundance. The Dunkirk spirit, a phrase coined by the press but soon spoken in every home, came to represent the best of the nation, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, standing together against impossible odds. It was the story of fishermen who crossed the channel under fire, of soldiers who waited calmly for boats that might never come, of nurses and engineers who worked without sleep. It was, in essence, the story of endurance, the quiet defiance of a people who refused to surrender even when surrounded by ruin. In the following years, writers and filmmakers transformed Dunkirk into myth. The early wartime films, The Big Blockade, Dunkirk, 1958, and countless documentaries, turned the evacuation into cinematic legend. There were no scenes of panic, no confusion, no despair. Only bravery, discipline, and hope. Soldiers queued in perfect order, sailors smoked stoically on deck. The chaos was edited into order, the terror rewritten as inspiration. For the men who had actually been there, the myth was both comforting and haunting. Many veterans carried deep guilt for surviving when so many hadn't. Others felt erased by the neatness of the legend. They called it a miracle, one infantryman recalled years later. But it didn't feel like a miracle when the man next to you drowned. Still, they did not deny the power of the story. Dunkirk gave them something larger than pain, it gave purpose to their suffering. In classrooms and films, Dunkirk became the turning point where Britain found itself, where retreat became resilience. It was taught not as a military failure but as a moral victory. The message was simple: even when outnumbered, outgunned, and out of options, unity and courage could save a nation. As the war continued, through the dark nights of the Blitz, through the years of rationing and fear, that idea sustained Britain. When bombs fell over London, people spoke of Dunkirk. When rations ran out and families took shelter underground, they said, "We'll get through this," like Dunkirk. The beaches had become a kind of national scripture. After the war, memorials rose on both sides of the channel. The sands of Dunkirk, once soaked in oil and blood, became a place of pilgrimage. Veterans returned to see the tide roll over the same shore where they had once waited for salvation. Each footprint erased by the sea became a silent echo of the men who had stood there. Even as decades passed, the Dunkirk spirit endured, invoked in times of crisis, political division, and national challenge. It came to mean something larger than the war, a reminder that unity, courage, and endurance could overcome even the darkest hour. Yet, the miracle was not magic. It was made by human hands, by the sweat, fear, and sacrifice of thousands. Behind the calm words "miracle of deliverance" were nights of terror, days of chaos, and the relentless will of people who simply refused to die. In 2017, nearly 80 years later, a new generation would see it through film once again. Dunkirk by Christopher Nolan, the story reborn in sound and silence, in terror and hope. And still, audiences left the theaters whispering the same thing that the world had said in 1940. How did they survive? The truth was never simple. Dunkirk was both disaster and deliverance, chaos and courage, despair and faith. It was a moment when defeat revealed the strength of the human spirit, when the tide of history, just for a moment, turned toward hope. And so the legend endures, not because it hides the pain, but because it reminds the world that even in the darkest hour, there can still be light. The ships returned, the army was saved, and a nation found its soul on those blackened sands. That was the true miracle of Dunkirk. For those who came back from Dunkirk, the war never truly ended. They lived, but in their memories, they never left the beach. When the ships finally reached Dover, the survivors of Dunkirk stepped onto British soil as men transformed. They had crossed not just the channel, but the threshold between life and death. They were greeted with cheers, tea, and blankets, but behind their hollow eyes was something deeper, the knowledge of what they had left behind. For years after, they struggled to put into words what they had seen. Many never tried. When asked about Dunkirk, they would simply say, "We were there," and fall silent. In letters written home during those days, the rawness of their emotions still burns through the paper. Private Arthur Mills, writing to his wife from a hospital bed in Canterbury, confessed, "I keep hearing them, the lads calling for help from the surf. I tried to pull one more aboard, but the boat was full." He said, "Go on then, mate," and I did. I can still see his face every night. He was one of the lucky ones. The guilt of survival, of walking off that beach when others did not, haunted countless men for the rest of their lives. When the war ended, the soldiers of Dunkirk returned to the world quietly. They became farmers, teachers, laborers, bus drivers. They married, raised families, rebuilt what had been destroyed. But in every reunion, every Remembrance Day, there was the unspoken bond, the understanding that they had shared something the rest of the world could not imagine. In 1950, a decade after the evacuation, the first Dunkirk Veterans Association was formed. Its meetings were not loud or ceremonial, they were gatherings of men who spoke in half-sentences and long silences. At pubs and church halls across Britain, they toasted the fallen with whiskey or beer, their hands shaking slightly as they raised their glasses. To outsiders, they looked like any group of old friends. But to them, it was sacred. Every man there remembered the cold of the sea, the smell of oil, the sound of Stuka's diving, and the waiting, that endless waiting for a boat that might never come. They remembered the ones who never made it, the faces half-lit by burning ships, the comrades whose names they whispered as the tide washed them away. Some tried to record their memories, though most found the words inadequate. Sergeant James Houghton, interviewed for the BBC in 1965, said, "They called it a miracle, but we didn't feel like miracles. We felt like ghosts." Others wrote diaries or memoirs decades later, their memories sharpened, not dulled, by time. In them, Dunkirk was not glory, but endurance, a story not of victory, but of survival paid for with too many lives. One veteran recalled that when the evacuation was over, he could not celebrate. "We left behind our friends, our guns, our pride," he said. "We came home with nothing but each other." For years, the soldiers carried that silence like a shadow. They built new lives on top of it, but every now and then, when they heard the sound of an airplane engine, or the crash of waves, the past came rushing back. When they reunited on anniversaries, the conversations often started with jokes, with small talk about weather or grandchildren. But inevitably, one would ask, "Do you remember that night?" And the air would change. The laughter would fade, replaced by that shared stillness, the memory of the waiting, the fear, and the strange calm that came with accepting death. Many of the survivors struggled with what we now know as trauma. They woke in the middle of the night gasping, hearing the sea. Some could not stand the smell of oil or the sound of gulls. But they rarely sought help. Their generation called it nerves or bad dreams. Instead, they found comfort in one another, in brotherhood. The reunions, the quiet letters between veterans, the annual trips back to France where they would stand together on the same sands where they once lay waiting. Some collected small jars of Dunkirk sand, sealed and kept on mantles as sacred relics. In later years, when journalists asked them how they wanted Dunkirk remembered, most gave the same answer, as it was, not a victory, not a miracle, but men helping each other to live. As the decades passed, the voices of the survivors grew fewer. The old uniforms no longer fit, the medals tarnished with time. But when they gathered one last time on the 75th anniversary, they stood in a line on the beach once more, their heads bowed to the wind, their eyes on the horizon. One of them, 98-year-old William Prentice, said softly to a young interviewer, "People ask what Dunkirk means. It means we didn't give up. That's all. We didn't give up." Behind him, the tide rolled in, erasing footprints just as it had in 1940. The sea, as always, remembered everything. For the survivors of Dunkirk, the miracle was not escape, it was endurance. The will to go on, to live ordinary lives after extraordinary horror. They carried the weight of that week for the rest of their days, not as heroes, but as witnesses. And when the last of them is gone, their silence will speak for them, a quiet echo across the sand and sea, whispering that even in retreat, courage can still define a generation. Dunkirk was both a battlefield and a story, and the story that survived was not always the same as the truth. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood at its lowest point, and the government knew it. The Empire's armies were gone from the continent, its weapons abandoned, its allies defeated. Yet the nation still needed something to believe in, some spark of pride amid the rubble. Dunkirk became that spark. What had been a desperate retreat was reborn as a miracle. It began almost immediately. Newspapers were forbidden from printing images that showed the chaos or the corpses on the beaches. The press instead carried headlines like "Great Deliverance by Sea" and "Miracle at Dunkirk." The photographs that appeared showed calm soldiers queuing in orderly lines, or smiling as they sipped tea back in England. The panic, the stampedes, the drowned, all vanished from the public eye. Wartime propaganda transformed the event into legend. Films and radio broadcasts emphasized courage, not collapse. Posters proclaimed they came back in "Dunkirk spirit, Britain can take it." In this version of events, Dunkirk was no longer an evacuation, it was a collective act of defiance, a victory of willpower against impossible odds. The truth, however, was far more complicated. For the soldiers who had been there, Dunkirk was not triumph but survival, bought with the blood of comrades and the loss of an entire arsenal. They remembered the burning ships, the screams, the stench of oil and fire. Many later said they never felt pride in that week, only relief and guilt. To them, the miracle was not divine, but human. It was the courage of the men who refused to panic. It was the sailors who came back again and again through smoke and bombs. It was the RAF pilots who fought unseen. But to call it victory, they thought, was to betray what it really was, a defeat turned bearable only by endurance. Historians, too, have long debated Dunkirk's meaning. Some see it as the pivotal moment that saved Britain. Without it, there would have been no army to defend the island, no Battle of Britain, no D-Day. Others see it as proof of failure, a sign that Allied leadership was unprepared, disorganized, and lucky to escape at all. In purely military terms, Dunkirk was a disaster. The British Expeditionary Force left behind 68,000 vehicles, 2,400 guns, and nearly all of its ammunition. It was, as Churchill admitted, a colossal military defeat. Yet in moral terms, it became something else, the story of a nation that refused to surrender even when cornered. The debate was never just about tactics, it was about meaning. Can survival alone be a kind of victory? Can retreat, if it preserves hope, be more powerful than conquest? For a Britain staring into the abyss of Nazi domination, the answer had to be yes. Churchill understood that better than anyone. His genius was not only in strategy, but in storytelling. He knew that morale was a weapon, and that words could shape history. His speech after Dunkirk was the turning point. "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall never surrender." With those words, the retreat became a rallying cry. Dunkirk was transformed from humiliation into heroism, from defeat into endurance. It was not the story of armies lost, but of a spirit unbroken. And so the Dunkirk spirit was born, a national myth that outlasted the war itself. It became shorthand for courage under pressure, for unity in crisis. It was invoked during the Blitz, during economic hardship, even decades later whenever Britain faced struggle. Remember Dunkirk, people would say, meaning, remember who we are when there's nothing left but willpower. But myths are never harmless. They simplify, they clean away the blood and smoke. The legend of Dunkirk made survival noble, but it also obscured the failures that led to the disaster, the complacency, the poor planning, the arrogance of believing that the Maginot Line would hold. For all the talk of miracles, Dunkirk was also a warning: bravery cannot always make up for bad leadership. For the soldiers who lived it, the myth was both a comfort and a wound. It gave meaning to their suffering, yet it erased their fear. One veteran put it bluntly. "They said we were heroes. But heroes don't run. We ran. And yet," he paused, then added softly, "but we came back. And maybe that's what mattered." That, perhaps, is the heart of Dunkirk's paradox. It was a story of retreat that became one of rebirth. It was defeat that inspired victory. It proved that even in losing everything, a nation could still find itself. The myth and the reality coexist, inseparable, necessary. The legend gave Britain hope, the truth gave it humility. Between them lies the real miracle of Dunkirk, not the ships, not the escape, but the transformation of despair into endurance, the human instinct to survive and, somehow, to find meaning in survival itself. Dunkirk was never just a battle, it was a revelation. Out of the chaos and fire came lessons that reshaped not only the British war effort but the very way the Allies would fight and lead in the years to come. It was studied in classrooms, analyzed in war colleges, and remembered in whispers among veterans who knew what it had really cost. For those who survived, Dunkirk was proof of something simple but profound, that courage could outlast catastrophe, and that even failure, if met with unity, could become the foundation of victory. In purely military terms, Dunkirk taught the world how thin the line between triumph and disaster could be. It showed how fragile modern warfare had become, how speed, mobility, and communication mattered more than size or tradition. The British Expeditionary Force, trapped on the beaches, had been outmaneuvered not by numbers but by the precision of German coordination. The Blitzkrieg, with its combination of armor, air power, and radio-linked strategy, had changed the rules of war forever. The British learned that lesson painfully, and quickly. Never again would they underestimate the importance of air superiority. At Dunkirk, the Royal Air Force had fought valiantly but at a terrible cost, often misunderstood by the soldiers below. Their unseen sacrifice became a lesson written in blood: control the skies, or lose everything. When the Battle of Britain began only weeks later, that principle would define the defense of the homeland. Logistics, too, had their reckoning. Dunkirk revealed how vital organization and improvisation were in war. The evacuation was not a planned masterpiece but a desperate improvisation, a patchwork of naval coordination, civilian courage, and sheer determination. The Royal Navy's ability to mobilize hundreds of ships in days, the quick construction of makeshift piers and the adaptation of civilian craft for military rescue, these acts became the blueprint for future amphibious operations. By the time the Allies returned to Europe in June 1944, every lesson of Dunkirk had been applied. The beaches of Normandy were not scenes of panic but of precision. The naval coordination, air cover, and logistical mastery that defined D-Day were born from the chaos of Dunkirk's retreat. What had once been an improvised miracle became, for years later, a calculated triumph. But beyond tactics, Dunkirk's most enduring lessons were moral and human. It showed what could happen when leadership refused to surrender to despair. Winston Churchill understood that a nation's greatest weapon was not its guns, but its will. His words after Dunkirk, "We shall never surrender," were not rhetoric, but resolve forged in necessity. Dunkirk taught the Allies that hope could be organized, that morale was not just sentiment but strategy. It reminded leaders that even in chaos, unity could turn disaster into endurance. The coordination between soldiers, sailors, civilians, and airmen was proof that courage was not limited to the battlefield. It existed in every dock worker, nurse, and fisherman who had played a part in the rescue. For the soldiers who escaped, the lesson was deeply personal. They had seen how fragile life was, how thin the boundary between survival and death. Many returned home humbled, stripped of illusions about glory. They carried with them an understanding that wars were not won by heroics alone, but by perseverance, by men who kept going simply because they refused to stop. The German command, too, learned from Dunkirk, though in a different way. They saw how overconfidence and poor coordination could unravel even the most brilliant advance. The Halt Order, Hitler's fatal hesitation, became a case study in arrogance and the dangers of centralizing command. Generals who had begged to press the attack realized too late that victory, once delayed, could vanish altogether. To the world, Dunkirk became a parable, a reminder that even when logic declares defeat inevitable, human spirit can still rewrite the outcome. Military historians would later call it a triumph of logistics. Poets and politicians called it something else, a triumph of the human heart. In classrooms and academies, the Dunkirk lesson became shorthand for resilience. It was studied not as a perfect operation, but as an imperfect miracle, one born from desperation, confusion, and courage. It reminded generations that leadership is not about control but about conviction, about standing firm when everything collapses around you. In the broader arc of history, Dunkirk's shadow extended far beyond 1940. It became a symbol of collective endurance, invoked during crises, economic hardships, and national trials. The Dunkirk spirit entered the language as a living ideal, to face disaster together, calmly and bravely, and to find strength not in certainty, but in unity. In the end, Dunkirk's greatest lesson was not military, but moral. It proved that even in retreat, dignity could survive, that even in chaos, order could emerge, that even in defeat, hope could still lead to victory. The evacuation may have saved an army, but it also saved something far greater, the belief that courage, compassion, and determination could still prevail when reason said they could not. When the tide turned years later, when Allied ships once again crossed the Channel, this time headed for Normandy, many of the men who stepped ashore had once waited on the beaches of Dunkirk. They carried with them the memory of smoke and fear, and the lesson it had etched into their souls, that survival is not the opposite of victory, but often its beginning. Dunkirk taught the world that courage is not measured by conquest, but by endurance, and that sometimes, to stand firm in the face of destruction is the greatest triumph of all. For decades, Dunkirk has lived not only in the memories of those who were there but in the stories told afterward, in the flicker of film reels, in the brushstrokes of painters, in the words of poets and novelists who tried to make sense of it all. What began as a desperate evacuation became, through art, one of the most enduring symbols of courage, chaos, and human endurance ever captured on screen or page. The first films and documentaries about Dunkirk appeared while the war was still raging. In 1940, the British Ministry of Information released short propaganda reels showing calm soldiers boarding ships, smiling as they arrived in Dover. The narration was steady and reassuring. They came back, every man a hero. These early depictions were not meant to tell the truth, they were meant to heal a nation that had been brought to its knees. The smoke, the fear, the screams, all were cut away. What remained was order, discipline, and faith. By the 1950s, when peace had settled and veterans began to speak, the first feature films took on the story. The most famous of the early works, Dunkirk, 1958, starred John Mills and Richard Attenborough and struck a delicate balance between patriotism and pain. For the first time, the beaches were shown not as the site of triumph, but of exhaustion, endless waiting, chaos, and survival bought at a terrible cost. The film captured both the pride and the trauma, and for a post-war audience still rebuilding itself, it resonated deeply. Through the 1960s and 70s, writers and artists began peeling away the myth. The novels of that era, such as Elliston Trevor's The Big Pickup and Ian McEwan's later Atonement, portrayed Dunkirk not as a singular miracle, but as a mosaic of human stories, the terrified conscript, the guilt-ridden officer, the civilians who became heroes by accident. These works shifted the focus from nation to individual, from the grand narrative of deliverance to the quiet tragedy of those who simply survived. Painters and photographers, too, reimagined Dunkirk in their own mediums. Artists like Paul Nash, who had seen the First World War, painted the beaches as landscapes of haunting beauty, the wreckage of ships transformed into skeletal silhouettes under a gray sky. War artists in Britain's Imperial War Museum sought to capture not the heroism, but the aftermath, the emptiness left when the miracle was over. By the turn of the 21st century, Dunkirk had become a story every generation rediscovered anew. Each retelling reflected the anxieties of its time. In the early post-war years, it was about resilience. In the Cold War, it became a lesson in unity. By the modern age, it had evolved into something universal, not just Britain's story, but humanity's. Then, in 2017, Christopher Nolan's film Dunkirk redefined the event for a new century. Stripped of politics and propaganda, it presented the evacuation as pure experience, fragmented, immersive, and overwhelming. There were no speeches, no grand strategies, just survival. The film's three intersecting timelines, land, sea, air, showed Dunkirk not as a historical drama, but as a sensory ordeal. Viewers could feel the sand beneath their feet, the claustrophobia of sinking ships, the whine of the Stukas above. Nolan's Dunkirk was not about nations or victory, it was about people. The boy on the pier waiting for a miracle. The pilot running out of fuel but refusing to turn back. The fisherman steering through fire because someone had to. It was an act of remembrance through emotion rather than dialogue, reminding audiences that courage often speaks in silence. Critics called it one of the greatest war films ever made, not because it glorified battle, but because it stripped away its illusions. It returned Dunkirk to its essence, the raw, human fight to endure. Veterans who watched it wept. Younger viewers, generations removed from the war, finally understood what those men had faced, not a clean narrative of heroism, but the chaos of fear and the miracle of simply staying alive. Beyond cinema, literature and poetry have continued to keep Dunkirk alive in quieter ways. Poets like Keith Douglas and Henry Reed wrote of the beaches not as victories, but as graves. Modern historians and authors, from Sebastian Faulks to Antony Beevor, have sought to balance myth and truth, peeling away layers of patriotic gloss to reveal the human heart beneath. Through it all, Dunkirk's artistic legacy has evolved alongside the world's understanding of war. What once served as propaganda became, over time, reflection, and finally, empathy. In every film, painting, and novel, the essence remains the same: men and women caught between annihilation and hope, their courage forged not in conquest but in survival. In a way, art succeeded where history could not. It gave voice to the silence, to the fear, the guilt, and the strange beauty of endurance. It reminded audiences that Dunkirk was not about glory, but about grace under fire. Today, when the word Dunkirk is spoken, it no longer belongs only to Britain or to the soldiers who lived it. It belongs to everyone who has ever stood against despair and refused to fall. Through art, the beaches live on, not as a place of defeat or deliverance, but as a mirror of humanity itself. Because in every generation, we still return to Dunkirk, not to relive the war, but to remember what it means to endure. Even as the generations who lived through Dunkirk fade into memory, the spirit of that week in 1940 endures, not merely as a story of war, but as a symbol of humanity's resilience. Dunkirk became more than a name or a battle, it became an idea. An idea that in the darkest moments, when logic dictates surrender and defeat seems certain, people can still find within themselves the courage to endure. Every year, on both sides of the channel, that idea is remembered. Along the harbor at Dunkirk, reeds are laid on the water, drifting quietly over the same tides that once carried soldiers home. In England, the surviving little ships, the fishing boats, lifeboats, ferries, and yachts that braved the channel's fire, are gathered and sailed again in solemn procession. Their engines hum softly, their decks lined with flags and flowers, each one a floating relic of what ordinary courage can accomplish. Children watch from the shore, their faces lit with curiosity and pride, while old men in dark coats stand silently, remembering. The little ships bob gently against the waves, still seaworthy, still proud, still alive. They are history made tangible, reminders that the past need not fade so long as the memory is carried forward on the water. The survivors who once manned those boats are mostly gone now, but their voices remain in interviews, journals, and film reels. One, speaking in his 90s, said softly, "We weren't heroes. We just couldn't leave them there." His words, like the event itself, embody the essence of Dunkirk, not glory, but duty, not victory, but compassion in the face of terror. Dunkirk's legacy has outlived the war that created it. It is taught not only in military academies, but in schools, where children learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. The Dunkirk spirit has become woven into Britain's national identity, invoked whenever the nation faces hardship, from wartime to peacetime crises. It represents a kind of moral DNA, the quiet, stubborn defiance that refuses to yield, even when surrounded by darkness. Politicians have borrowed the phrase, journalists have revived it, and communities have embodied it, in storms, in recessions, in moments of collective struggle. The world may have changed, but the emotional truth of Dunkirk has not. It remains a story of people, not power, of ordinary men and women who refused to give up on one another. And it was never just Britain's story. Across the world, Dunkirk has come to represent something universal, the triumph of cooperation over chaos, of compassion over fear. The French soldiers who fought to the last in the dunes, the Polish pilots who shielded the skies, the Belgian civilians who guided soldiers to the coast, all became part of a shared human testament, that even in retreat, there can be dignity, and in survival, there can be victory. The beaches themselves have changed. Where there was once fire and smoke, there are now gulls and wind. The sand that was once blackened by oil and blood is pale again, shifting softly under the tide. But sometimes, when the water recedes just right, a rusted engine part or a piece of shrapnel emerges, a quiet reminder that beneath the calm surface lies the memory of chaos. Each year, the tide washes away footprints, but not history. And when the sun sets over Dunkirk, the horizon glows the same faint red it did in 1940, as if the world still remembers the fire that once burned there. The miracle of Dunkirk is often described as an escape, but in truth, it was a revelation, proof that hope can rise even in retreat. That an army without weapons, a nation without allies, and a people surrounded by defeat can still find a way to endure. In the end, Dunkirk was not the end of a war, but the beginning of a belief that survival itself can be an act of victory. The little ships still sail, the sea still whispers, and the story continues to move with the tide, eternal, untamed, and alive in the hearts of all who believe that, even when all seems lost, humanity can still find its way home.